My name is Michael Torres, and I've been a park ranger here at Cascade Ridge State Park for 17 years. I've seen plenty of things that stick with you people who get in over their heads. Accidents that could have been prevented. The occasional tragedy that reminds you why we have all these rules and regulations. But there's one thing that happened back in 2021 that I still can't shake. It was early September, just after Labor Day weekend, when the crowds thin out and the forest starts to settle into that quiet autumn rhythm. I was doing my regular patrol of the backcountry camping areas when I came across Site 14 on Blackwater Ridge. It's a popular spot, elevated about 2,000 feet with a decent view of the valley, but remote enough that you need to hike about 3 miles to reach it. The kind of place that attracts families who really know what they're doing outdoors. The first thing I noticed was how perfectly everything was arranged. I've seen thousands of campsites over the years, and there's usually some level of controlled chaos gear scattered around, maybe a camp chair knocked over. The organized mess that comes with people living outdoors for a few days. But this site looked like a photograph from a camping magazine. The tent was a high-end 4-person model, properly staked and rainfly secured. 2 camp chairs were positioned precisely around a cold fire pit. The kind of positioning that takes thought. A small folding table held what appeared to be the remnants of breakfast. 2 plates with eggs and bacon, only half eaten. Utensils placed neatly beside them like someone had been called away mid-bite. The camp stove was still set up on a flat rock, a blue enamel coffee pot sitting on the burner. When I touched the pot, it was still warm, not hot, but warm enough that it couldn't have been sitting there long. Maybe an hour, maybe less. What really caught my attention were the details. 4 pairs of hiking boots lined up beside the tent entrance, largest to smallest. 2 adult pairs, 2 smaller ones that looked like they belonged to children. They were arranged with the kind of precision you might see at the entrance to someone's home, not at a remote campsite, where convenience usually trumps neatness. I called out, thinking maybe the family was just out for a morning hike. "Hello? Anyone around?" My voice carried across the ridge, but all I heard back was the wind through the pines. I walked the perimeter of the site, looking for obvious signs of where they might have gone. No trail seemed disturbed, no indication of which direction they'd headed. That's when I started noticing things that didn't add up. The car keys were sitting on the camp table, attached to a rental car fob. Their wallets were there too, 2 adult wallets with identification, credit cards, even cash, still inside. In 17 years, I'd never seen campers leave valuables just sitting out like that, especially not car keys. I hiked back to their vehicle, a silver SUV parked at the Blackwater Ridge trailhead. Pennsylvania plates, everything locked up tight, nothing unusual about it. But the fact that their keys were back at the campsite meant they weren't planning to drive anywhere anytime soon. I returned to the site and started a more thorough investigation. The sleeping bags were unzipped and pulled back, like people had gotten up naturally that morning. Personal items were distributed around the tent with the kind of casual placement that suggests comfort and routine. Toiletries organized on a small camp shelf, clothes folded in neat piles. A book opened face down on one of the camp chairs with a bookmark still holding the place. The more I looked, the more the scene felt frozen in time, like someone had taken a snapshot of a normal family camping trip and then carefully removed the people while leaving everything else untouched. I radioed back to headquarters and reported what I'd found. My supervisor, Janet, has been with the Park Service longer than I have, and she's seen her share of unusual situations. But even she seemed puzzled when I described the scene. "Any signs of struggle?" she asked. "None at all. Everything's perfectly arranged. It looks like they just stepped away for a minute. Weather issues? Animals? Weather's been clear for 3 days. No signs of wildlife disturbance. The food was still sitting out untouched. Within 2 hours, we had a search and rescue operation underway. The family's identification told us their names, David and Linda Morrison, traveling with their 2 children, ages 10 and 12. They'd registered for a 3-night camping permit and were supposed to check out the following day. We established a search perimeter and brought in additional personnel. The terrain around Blackwater Ridge is challenging but not impossible. Steep in some areas, but well marked with clear sight lines. The kind of place where it would be difficult for 4 people to just vanish without leaving some kind of trail. For the next 3 days, we searched an expanding radius around the campsite. We brought in trained dogs, helicopter support, even a few volunteer groups with local knowledge of the area. We found nothing. No footprints leading away from the site. No disturbed vegetation. No pieces of clothing or equipment. Nothing that indicated which direction they might have gone or what might have happened to them. The dogs were particularly puzzling. Usually, they can pick up a scent trail pretty quickly, especially with personal items to work from. But the dogs seemed confused around the campsite. They'd circle the area, whine, then sit down and refuse to track in any particular direction. Our lead handler said she'd never seen anything quite like it. On the 4th day, we had to scale back the search. The state police took over the investigation, treating it as a missing persons case. They interviewed family members, checked financial records, looked into the possibility that the family had staged their own disappearance. But everything checked out. They were exactly who they appeared to be, with no reason to vanish voluntarily. The case stayed active for months, but gradually it moved to the back burner. The Morrisons' extended family offered a reward, and their story appeared in newspapers and on missing persons websites. But no new information ever emerged. About 6 months later, I was assigned to dismantle their campsite. The tent and equipment had been left in place during the investigation, protected by weather tarps and secured with Park Service tape. Walking back into that site felt deeply unsettling, like entering a place that had been abandoned much longer than it actually had been. As I packed up their belongings for storage, I found myself paying attention to small details that hadn't seemed significant during the initial search. A child's journal with entries right up until the day they disappeared, describing how excited they were about seeing stars without city lights. A grocery receipt showing they'd bought supplies just 2 days before their trip, including the exact coffee brand that had been in the pot I'd found still warm. The personal nature of these items made the absence feel more profound. These weren't just missing people, they were individuals with daily routines, preferences, plans for the future. The journal mentioned looking forward to school starting in a few weeks. The receipt included items for lunches they'd never pack. The official report concluded that the Morrison family had left their campsite voluntarily for unknown reasons and had encountered some kind of accident or misfortune in the wilderness. But that explanation never sat right with me. In 17 years of backcountry work, I've seen how people behave in emergency situations. They don't carefully arrange their boots by the tent entrance. They don't leave wallets and car keys sitting on tables. They don't pour coffee and then walk away from breakfast half finished. 3 years have passed since that September morning, and I still patrol Blackwater Ridge as part of my regular route. Site 14 is back in use, popular as ever with families who appreciate the view and the challenge of the hike. But every time I pass through that area, I find myself driving slower than usual, looking more carefully at the campsites, paying attention to details that most people wouldn't notice. Sometimes I wonder if there's something about that particular spot that I missed during the investigation, some geographic feature or historical detail that might explain what happened. I've researched the area's history, talked to longtime locals, even consulted with geologists about unusual terrain features. Nothing has provided any insight. What bothers me most is how normal everything looked. If the Morrisons had encountered some kind of danger, you'd expect to see signs of alarm or hasty departure. If they'd decided to leave voluntarily, you'd expect them to pack their belongings and secure their valuables. The scene I discovered that morning suggested neither emergency nor planned departure. It suggested interruption. I've never talked publicly about some of the smaller details that stuck with me from that day. How the coffee in that pot was exactly the right temperature, like someone had just finished brewing it. How the eggs on those plates were still slightly warm when I touched them with the back of my hand. How the book on the camp chair was open to a page that would take exactly the right amount of time to reach if someone had been reading while drinking their morning coffee. The timing bothers me most of all. Everything at that campsite suggested I had missed the Morrison family by minutes, not hours. But I'd been hiking toward their site for over an hour before I arrived, and I hadn't passed anyone on the trail. The path to Blackwater Ridge has very few places where you can step off without being visible, especially for a group of 4 people, including 2 children. I still file reports every time I patrol that area, noting camper activity and trail conditions. Site 14 gets used regularly, and I've never observed anything unusual about subsequent visitors. Families camp there, enjoy the view, pack up their belongings, and hike back to their cars like people have been doing for decades. But I always find myself checking more carefully when I'm in that area, counting the pairs of boots outside tents, looking at how camp tables are arranged, paying attention to whether coffee pots are still warm and breakfast plates still have food on them. I suppose what haunts me most is the possibility that I might have been able to help if I'd arrived at Site 14 just a few minutes earlier. That whatever happened to the Morrison family might have been prevented by simple timing, by a ranger showing up at exactly the right moment instead of exactly the wrong one. 3 years later, I still drive past that spot, slower than I should. My name is Lisa Chen, and I've been coordinating search and rescue operations in the Blue Ridge Mountains for 14 years. I've managed recoveries in terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers, organized searches that lasted weeks, and I've brought people home alive when everyone else had given up hope. But there's one case from 2022 that still keeps me up at night. Not because we failed, but because we succeeded in ways I'm still trying to understand. It was mid-October when Sarah Kellerman went missing. She was 28, an experienced day hiker who knew these mountains well. She'd grown up about 40 minutes from the park and had been hiking these trails since she was a teenager. Her husband Mark called us when she didn't return from what should have been a routine 6-mile loop on the Laurel Creek Trail. Sarah had left that Tuesday morning around 8, planning to be back by early afternoon. She was the kind of hiker who stuck to schedules, always carried proper gear, always let people know her exact route and expected return time. When she hadn't come home by 6 that evening and wasn't answering her phone, Mark drove to the trailhead and found her car still parked there. We started the search Wednesday morning. The Laurel Creek Trail is well maintained and popular, but it passes through some challenging terrain where a single misstep could lead to serious trouble. The weather had been clear but cold, with overnight temperatures dropping into the 30s. I coordinated ground teams while our helicopter unit conducted aerial reconnaissance. We had dogs, experienced trackers, and volunteers who knew the area intimate. The trail system is extensive, but there are only so many places someone can go, especially someone following established routes. By Thursday, we'd covered the main trail and all obvious side paths. The dogs had picked up Sarah's scent along the first 2 miles of the trail, but lost it completely near Sunset Overlook, a popular rest area with views of the valley. It was like she'd simply stopped existing at that point. We expanded the search radius on Friday, bringing in additional resources and extending our coverage into more remote areas. Sarah's family arrived from various parts of the state, setting up what amounted to a base camp in the parking area. Her mother brought recent photos and detailed information about Sarah's hiking habits, favorite spots, and any places she might have deviated from the planned route. What struck me about Sarah's family was how unified they were in their description of her. Responsible, methodical, cautious. Her younger sister Emily kept repeating that Sarah would never take unnecessary risks, never go off trail without telling someone, never make the kind of mistakes that lead to serious trouble in the wilderness. The search entered its 6th day on Monday, and I was starting to prepare the family for the possibility that we might not find Sarah alive. October weather in the mountains can turn deadly quickly, and 6 nights outdoors without proper shelter would challenge even experienced survivalists. That's when one of our volunteers radioed in from the trailhead parking area. "Lisa, "You need to get down here. We found her." I assumed they meant they'd found Sarah's body, and I started preparing myself for the worst part of this job, the conversation no coordinator ever wants to have with a family. But when I arrived at the parking area, Sarah Kellerman was sitting on a picnic table, very much alive, talking quietly with one of our volunteers. She looked remarkably good for someone who'd spent 6 days missing in the wilderness. Her clothes were dirty, and she appeared tired, but she wasn't showing signs of serious exposure or dehydration. No obvious injuries, no indication of the kind of ordeal you'd expect someone to have endured. "Sarah?" I approached carefully, still not quite believing what I was seeing. "Are you all right? Where have you been?" She looked at me with a kind of calm confusion, like someone trying to remember something that was just out of reach. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm not sure why everyone's so worried." Her family surrounded her then, crying and asking questions, but Sarah seemed almost puzzled by their emotional response. She hugged them back when they embraced her, but there was something distant about it, like she was going through motions she remembered but didn't quite feel. The paramedics checked her over and found nothing concerning. Mild dehydration, some superficial scratches, but nothing that suggested she'd been struggling to survive for nearly a week. Her vital signs were normal, her mental status appeared clear, and she was able to answer basic questions about her identity and current circumstances. But when we asked where she'd been, Sarah's responses were frustratingly vague. She remembered starting her hike on Tuesday morning, remembered reaching the first-mile marker, but after that, everything became uncertain. She thought she might have gotten turned around somewhere, might have spent time resting, but she couldn't provide specific details about where she'd stayed or how she'd managed for food and water. "I think I was walking," she said when I pressed for more information. "I remember walking for a long time, and it was quiet." The medical team recommended taking her to the hospital for observation, but Sarah declined. She said she felt fine and just wanted to go home. Her family was so relieved to have her back that they didn't push the issue. I completed the paperwork that evening, officially closing the search and rescue operation as a successful recovery. But something about the whole situation felt incomplete. In 14 years of coordinating searches, I'd never seen someone reappear like that, just sitting calmly at the trailhead, with no clear explanation of where they'd been or how they'd survived. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about details that hadn't seemed significant at the time. How clean Sarah had looked for someone who'd supposedly been lost in the wilderness for 6 days. How her hiking boots showed very little wear, despite her claim that she'd been walking for a long time. How calm she'd been about the whole experience, like being missing for nearly a week, was a minor inconvenience rather than a potentially life-threatening situation. I stayed in touch with the family, partly for follow-up documentation, and partly because I genuinely wanted to make sure Sarah was adjusting well after her experience. That's when I started hearing about the changes. Emily called me about a month after the search ended. She was concerned because Sarah hadn't been the same since coming back. Not in obvious ways, she was functioning normally, going to work, maintaining her daily routines, but she'd stopped talking about hiking completely, despite it being something she'd been passionate about her entire life. "She won't even discuss it," Emily told me. "We'll mention a trail we used to hike together, and she just changes the subject. It's like that part of her life just ended." More concerning were the subtle personality changes that family members were noticing. Sarah had always been social and engaged, someone who asked questions and showed interest in other people's activities. But now, she seemed emotionally flattened somehow, going through social interactions without the curiosity and warmth that had defined her before. Her husband Mark mentioned that Sarah would sometimes sit in their backyard for hours, just staring at the tree line. When he asked what she was thinking about, she'd say she was just enjoying the quiet. But he said there was something unsettling about how still she could be, how long she could sit without moving, or apparently thinking about anything at all. The family encouraged Sarah to see a counselor, thinking she might be dealing with trauma from her experience in the wilderness. She agreed, attended a few sessions, but told them she didn't think it was helping. because she couldn't remember anything traumatic happening. I reached out to Sarah directly about 6 months after the search, ostensibly to follow up on some paperwork, but really because I was curious about her perspective on what had happened. We met for coffee in town, and the conversation was cordial, but strange. Sarah seemed pleasant enough, but there was a quality of distance about her that I found difficult to pinpoint. She answered my questions about her recovery and current well-being, but her responses felt rehearsed, like she was telling me what she thought I wanted to hear, rather than sharing genuine thoughts or feelings. When I asked if she had any theories about where she'd been during those 6 days, Sarah paused for a long moment before answering. "I think I was somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere I could rest." "But you don't remember specifics about the location?" "No, just that it was peaceful." Something about the way she said peaceful bothered me, though I couldn't explain why. It wasn't that the word itself was concerning, but the way she used it suggested an experience that went beyond simple tranquility, like she'd found something in those missing days that had fundamentally changed how she related to the world. I asked if she missed hiking, and Sarah gave me a look that was difficult to interpret. Not sad exactly, but resigned. "I don't think about it anymore," she said. "You don't think about hiking specifically, or you don't think about being outdoors." "I don't think about going back out there." The emphasis she placed on "out there" suggested she was referring to something more specific than just wilderness areas in general, like there was a particular place or experience she was deliberately avoiding. That conversation was 2 years ago now, and I still find myself thinking about Sarah Kellerman when I'm coordinating searches in the same area where she went missing. We've had other cases since then, some successful recoveries and some that ended badly, but none that left me with the same sense of unresolved questions. I've walked the Laurel Creek Trail dozens of times since Sarah's case, paying particular attention to the area around Sunset Overlook where the dogs lost her scent. There's nothing obviously unusual about the terrain. No hidden caves or difficult-to-reach areas where someone could shelter for an extended period. It's just a standard mountain trail with typical Blue Ridge topography. But I've started noticing how quiet that particular stretch of trail can be. Even when other areas of the park are busy with hikers and campers, the section near Sunset Overlook often feels isolated and still, not in a peaceful way, but in a way that makes you aware of being alone. I spoke with Emily again recently, and she mentioned that Sarah seems stable but unchanged, still distant, still uninterested in outdoor activities, still prone to those long periods of sitting quietly and staring at nothing in particular. The family has adapted to this new version of Sarah, but Emily said they all feel like they're interacting with someone who's fundamentally different from the person who went missing that October day. "It's like she came back, but not all the way," Emily told me. "Something stayed out there. I don't know what happened to Sarah Kellerman during those 6 days she was missing. I don't know where she was, how she survived, or why she can't remember. But I do know that the woman we found sitting at that trailhead wasn't quite the same person who had started hiking 6 days earlier. In search and rescue, we measure success by bringing people home alive. By that standard, Sarah's case was one of our victories. But sometimes I wonder if there are different kinds of missing and different kinds of coming back, and whether we always understand what we've actually recovered from the wilderness. 2 years later, I still drive past the Laurel Creek trailhead more slowly than I need to. Still find myself looking for Sarah's car in the parking area, even though I know she'll never go back there. And I still wonder what kind of quiet she found in those missing days, and why she chose to leave part of herself in it. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been working fire lookout towers in the Cascade National Forest for 11 years. It's solitary work that attracts a particular kind of person, someone who can handle weeks alone in a small cabin perched on a mountaintop, scanning endless miles of forest for the first signs of smoke. Most people think it sounds peaceful, and usually it is. But there's one incident from 3 summers ago that changed how I think about what we actually see from up there. Danny Reeves had been working Tower 7 for 3 seasons when this happened. He was reliable, methodical. Someone who understood that our evening radio check-ins weren't just protocol, but a lifeline that connected us to the world below. Every tower operator reports in at 6 p.m. sharp weather conditions, visibility, any unusual activity in their sector. It's a routine that becomes as automatic as breathing. Tower 7 sits about 8 miles northeast of my station, positioned on a ridge that offers a commanding view of some of the most remote wilderness in the forest. Danny's coverage area included sections where hikers might not see another person for weeks, where wildlife corridors stretch unbroken for miles, where the landscape can hide secrets in ways that flatter terrain cannot. The first evening Danny missed check-in was July 15th, 2021. When 6 p.m. came and went without hearing from him, I tried raising him directly on the radio. No response. The dispatcher tried as well, with the same result. In our line of work, equipment failure isn't uncommon, so we logged it as a technical issue and planned to check on him the next day. But when Danny missed the second evening check-in, concerns started building. 2 consecutive equipment failures were possible, but unlikely, and Danny had never been unreliable about maintaining his radio gear. The dispatcher authorized a welfare check, but the earliest we could get personnel up to Tower 7 was the following morning. Missing the third check-in moved the situation from concern to active worry. 3 days of radio silence from a remote fire tower suggested something more serious than equipment problem. I volunteered to make the hike to Tower 7, partly because I knew Danny well, and partly because the route from my tower was more direct than the approach from the main road. The hike to Tower 7 takes about 4 hours through terrain that starts gradual but becomes increasingly steep as you approach the ridge. It's not a difficult walk for someone in reasonable shape, but it's remote enough that you need to plan carefully and carry appropriate gear. The trail is well maintained but sees very little traffic outside of official Forest Service business. I started early on the morning of July 18th, carrying basic medical supplies and a backup radio in case Danny's equipment had failed completely. The weather was clear and warm, perfect conditions for hiking and for fire detection work. As I climbed higher, I could see Tower 7 in the distance, a small structure perched on what looked like an impossibly narrow ridge. What struck me first when I reached the tower was how normal everything appeared. The generator was running, providing power to the cabin. Danny's truck was parked in its usual spot beside the access road. Supplies were neatly organized on the small porch, and there were no obvious signs of distress or emergency. I climbed the metal stairs to the cabin, calling out as I approached. "Danny, it's Jake. You missed check-in, so I came to see if you needed help with your radio." No response from inside the cabin. The door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual for fire towers during active duty periods. I knocked once more before entering, half expecting to find Danny dealing with some kind of technical problem or minor injury that had prevented him from reaching his radio. Instead, I found him sitting at his desk, facing the large windows that provided the panoramic view necessary for fire detection work. He was upright in his chair, hands resting on the desk surface, looking out toward the western section of his coverage area. From behind, he appeared alert and engaged, like someone actively scanning the forest for signs of trouble. "Danny?" I said again, moving around to where I could see his face. His eyes were open, focused on something in the distance, but he didn't acknowledge my presence. I spoke his name several more times, with increasing volume, but got no response. He wasn't unconscious, his posture was too controlled for that, and his eyes tracked movement when I waved my hand in front of his face. But he seemed completely disconnected from immediate surroundings. I checked for obvious signs of injury or medical distress. His pulse was steady, his breathing normal, no visible wounds or indicators of trauma. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, clean and properly maintained. The cabin around him was organized and functional, with no signs of struggle or emergency. But Danny remained completely unresponsive to any attempt at communication. He wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't look directly at me, wouldn't acknowledge that anyone else was in the room. His entire attention seemed focused on whatever he was observing through that western window. I tried following his line of sight, looking out at the same section of forest that had captured his attention. The view from Tower 7 is spectacular. On clear days, miles of unbroken wilderness stretching toward distant mountain peaks. But I couldn't identify anything unusual or noteworthy about the particular area where Danny seemed to be focused. The radio equipment was functioning properly. I ran a communications check and was able to reach both the dispatcher and my own tower without difficulty. Whatever had prevented Danny from making his evening check-ins wasn't related to technical failure. I spent about 2 hours in the cabin, trying different approaches to reach Danny. I prepared food, thinking hunger might motivate some kind of response. I played music from his personal collection, hoping familiar sounds might break through whatever was occupying his attention. I even tried describing what I was seeing from the windows, thinking he might react to observations about his coverage area. Nothing worked. Danny remained in the same position, focused on the same distant point, unreachable despite being physically present. Eventually, I radioed for medical evacuation, though I wasn't sure how to describe Danny's condition. He wasn't injured, wasn't unconscious, wasn't displaying obvious symptoms of any medical emergency I could recognize. But he was clearly in need of help that I couldn't provide from a remote fire tower. The helicopter arrived about 3 hours later, and the paramedics were as puzzled as I had been. Danny's vital signs were normal. He showed no signs of physical trauma, and basic neurological tests suggested normal brain function. But he remained completely unresponsive to verbal communication and continued staring out that western window even as strangers moved around him and prepared him for transport. They had to physically guide him to the helicopter. He didn't resist, but he didn't assist either. He moved when directed but seemed to be participating only in the most passive sense, like someone sleepwalking through a complex routine. I stayed at Tower 7 long enough to secure the cabin and complete a preliminary report. As I was preparing to leave, I found myself standing at the same window where Danny had been positioned, looking out at the same section of forest that had captured his attention. The view was typical for the area-dense stands of Douglas fir and pine, a few small meadows, several ridgelines extending toward the horizon. Wildlife was visible if you knew what to look for, and the afternoon light created the kind of dramatic shadows and highlights that make fire detection work both challenging and rewarding. But I couldn't identify anything specific that would warrant the kind of sustained attention Danny had been giving it. No smoke, no unusual movement, no geographic features that seemed particularly noteworthy, just wilderness, looking the way wilderness is supposed to look. The medical evaluation concluded that Danny was experiencing some form of catatonic episode, possibly triggered by stress or isolation. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility for observation and treatment, where he remained for about 6 weeks. During that time, he gradually became more responsive to immediate surroundings and was eventually able to participate in conversations and basic activities. But Danny never talked about what had happened at Tower 7. Not to the doctors, not to his family, not to any of us who worked with him. When asked directly about his experience, he would say he didn't remember or would change the subject. The medical report noted that his memory of the period immediately before his evacuation was unclear, possibly due to the psychological state that had made him unresponsive. When Danny was released from the hospital, the Forest Service offered him a transfer to a ground-based position in the main office. He accepted without hesitation and never requested to return to fire tower duty. His new job involved coordinating supply deliveries and maintaining equipment inventories, important work, but completely removed from the isolation and observation responsibilities of tower operations. I've seen Danny a few times since then at staff meetings and training sessions. He seems to be functioning well in his new role, participating normally in conversations and maintaining the professional relationships you'd expect. But there's something different about him now, a quality of careful attention that wasn't there before, like someone who's become permanently alert to possibilities that other people don't notice. More significantly, Danny won't discuss fire tower work at all. In a group of people who love talking shop about the challenges and rewards of wilderness observation, Danny simply disengages whenever the conversation turns to tower operations. Not defensively, but with the kind of quiet finality that discourages follow-up questions. I was assigned to cover Tower 7 for the remainder of that season, and have been back several times since for temporary duty when regular operators needed time off. It's a standard fire tower with typical responsibilities and working conditions. The equipment functions properly, the living quarters are comfortable, and the views are excellent for fire detection work. But I've never been able to shake the memory of finding Danny there, so completely absorbed in whatever he was observing that he'd lost contact with everything else around him. I've spent hours looking out that same western window, trying to understand what could have captured his attention so completely that he forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, forgot to check in with the outside world. The area Danny was focused on has had normal activity in the years since wildlife movement, seasonal changes, occasional hikers passing through. I've documented everything I've observed from that position, both during routine fire surveillance and out of curiosity about Danny's experience. Nothing I've seen explains what happened to him, but sometimes, usually in the late afternoon when the light starts to change, I find myself paying particular attention to that same section of forest. Not because I see anything unusual, but because I remember how intently Danny had been watching it, and I wonder what he might have noticed that I'm missing. The official report classified Danny's case as a medical episode related to occupational stress and isolation. He received appropriate treatment, successfully transitioned to a new position, and continues to work for the Forest Service in a capacity that suits his current needs. By administrative standards, it was a positive outcome. But those of us who work the towers know that Danny saw something out there, something that changed how he relates to wilderness observation work, something that made him choose a job where he never has to look out at miles of empty forest and wonder what might be looking back. 3 years later, I still work Tower 7 when needed, and I still complete my evening check-ins at 6 p.m. sharp. But I've never forgotten how Danny looked sitting at that desk, so focused on something in the distance that he couldn't hear his own name being called. And I've never stopped wondering what he saw out there that was important enough to lose himself in. My name is Amanda Stewart, and I've been a park ranger at Sequoia Ridge State Park for 15 years. In that time, I've walked every marked trail in our system, many of them dozens of times, and I know the geography of this place like other people know their neighborhood streets. I can tell you which overlook offers the best sunrise views, which creek crossings become dangerous during spring runoff, and which sections of trail are most likely to challenge inexperienced hikers. But there's one missing person case from 2 years ago that made me question whether I really know this landscape as well as I thought I did. Marcus Chen disappeared on a Tuesday morning in late September 2022. He was 34, an experienced day hiker from Sacramento who visited our park regularly. His girlfriend reported him missing when he failed to return from what was supposed to be a routine 8-mile loop on the Granite Peak Trail. She'd expected him back by early afternoon, and when evening came with no sign of him, she called our emergency line. We initiated a search the following morning, covering the Granite Peak Trail and all connecting routes. The weather had been stable, clear skies with mild temperatures, nothing that would create unusual hazards for someone with Marcus's experience level. His car was still in the parking area, properly locked, with no signs of disturbance. The search continued for 4 days, expanding to cover increasingly remote areas beyond the established trail system. We brought in helicopter support, search dogs, and volunteer teams familiar with the terrain. Despite extensive coverage of the area, we found no trace of Marcus Chen, no abandoned equipment, no footprints leading off established trails, no indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. On the 5th day, one of our search teams found Marcus's camera about 2 miles off the Granite Peak Trail, in an area of dense forest that would be difficult to reach without deliberately leaving marked routes. The camera was a professional-grade digital model, the kind serious photographers use for landscape work. It was lying beside a fallen log, partially concealed by undergrowth, but in good condition, despite several days of exposure to outdoor conditions. Processing personal effects from missing person cases is part of my job, but it's never routine. These items represent someone's last known activities, their final conscious decisions, and examining them always feels like an invasion of privacy, even when it's necessary for the investigation. Marcus's camera contained 43 photographs from his final hike, documenting his progress along the Granite Peak Trail from early morning through what appeared to be mid-afternoon. The images showed typical hiking photography, scenic overlooks, interesting rock formations, wildlife sightings, and a few self-portraits at recognizable landmarks. I reviewed each photograph carefully, looking for anything that might indicate where Marcus had gone after taking his last picture, or what might have led him to leave the established trail system. The timestamps showed regular intervals, suggesting he'd been maintaining a steady pace and stopping periodically to document interesting features along the route. The final photograph, taken at 2:37 p.m. according to the camera's internal clock, showed Marcus himself. It was clearly a self-portrait, taken with extended arms in the style that hikers commonly use to document their outdoor experiences. He was smiling, looking relaxed and comfortable, wearing the same clothes described in the missing person report. But as I studied the background of that final image, I realized something was wrong. Marcus appeared to be standing on a section of trail that looked familiar. The rock surface, the general topography, even the angle of afternoon sunlight were consistent with areas I knew well. But the landscape visible behind him didn't match any location within our park system. The background showed a distinctive rock formation, a dramatic spire of dark stone rising several hundred feet above the surrounding forest. It was the kind of geological feature that would be prominent on trail maps, mentioned in guidebooks, and well known to anyone who spent time in the area. But I'd never seen it before. I spent the rest of that day comparing the photograph to topographical maps, aerial surveys, and my own extensive collection of images from throughout the park. The rock formation in Marcus's final photo simply didn't exist anywhere within our boundaries. I consulted with colleagues who had even more experience in the area than I did, including rangers who'd been working these mountains for 20 or 30 years. I showed them the photograph without explaining the context, asking if they recognized the location. None of them could identify where it had been taken. We expanded our search to include areas outside the park boundaries, thinking Marcus might have wandered onto adjacent public lands or private property. But the neighboring territories were well mapped, and none contained geological features that matched what was visible in the photograph. The investigation continued for several more weeks, but without additional leads or evidence, the case eventually moved to inactive status. Marcus Chen remained missing, with no explanation for his disappearance and no clear indication of where to continue looking. I kept a copy of that final photograph, partly for professional reasons and partly because it bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate. During quiet periods at work, I would study it again, trying to understand how Marcus could have been standing in a location that appeared to be within our park system but contained landscape features that didn't exist. Over the following months, I began paying closer attention to the areas where the camera had been found, hiking off-trail routes that Marcus might have taken. I was looking for any vantage point that might explain the photograph, any angle or perspective that could account for what I was seeing in that final image. I found several locations where the immediate foreground matched elements visible in the photograph: rock surfaces, vegetation patterns, even lighting conditions that were consistent with what Marcus had captured. But none of these locations offered views of the dramatic rock spire that dominated the background of his final picture. The more I studied the photograph, the more convinced I became that Marcus had been standing somewhere within our park system when he took it. The foreground details were too specific, too consistent with known terrain to have been captured elsewhere. But the background landscape remained impossible to explain. I started researching the geological history of the region, wondering if there might be natural features that were somehow hidden from standard observation points. or if changes in vegetation or lighting could create visual effects that I wasn't accounting for. But nothing in the research provided explanations for what Marcus had photographed. About a year after the initial search, I was contacted by Marcus's girlfriend, who wanted to visit the area where his camera had been found. She was hoping for some kind of closure, some way to understand what had happened to him. I agreed to guide her to the location, though I warned her that we hadn't discovered any new information about his disappearance. As we hiked to the spot where the camera had been recovered, she asked to see the final photograph again. I'd shown it to her during the initial investigation, but she wanted to look at it more carefully now that she was in the actual terrain where it had been taken. "That rock formation," she said, pointing to the distinctive spire visible in the background. "Marcus photographed something like that on a trip to Utah 2 years ago, but it was much smaller, and the shape was different." She showed me images from Marcus's Utah trip on her phone. There was indeed a rock formation, with some superficial similarities to what appeared in his final photograph, but the scale and specific geometry were completely different. Still, it was the first time anyone had identified anything even remotely similar to the landscape Marcus had captured. "He was always interested in geological formations," she continued. "He used to say that rocks told stories about places that existed millions of years ago, before the landscape changed into what we see now." That conversation stayed with me, particularly her comment about landscapes that existed before they changed into current forms. I started thinking about the geological processes that shape mountain regions over time, and whether it was possible that Marcus had somehow photographed features that weren't currently visible from standard observation points. But even accounting for erosion, vegetation growth, and other natural changes, I couldn't explain how a rock formation of that size and prominence could exist anywhere within our park system without being widely known and documented. 2 years have passed since Marcus Chen disappeared, and his case remains unsolved. I still work the same trails, conduct the same routine patrols, and assist with search and rescue operations when needed. But I've never stopped thinking about that final photograph and what it might represent. I've shown the image to geologists, photographers, and other professionals who might offer technical insights into what Marcus captured. Most suggest that it could be a digital manipulation, multiple images combined to create a composite that never actually existed. But the metadata from the camera shows no evidence of digital alteration, and Marcus's girlfriend insists he wasn't skilled with photo editing software. Others have suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions could create optical effects that might explain the discrepancy between the photograph and known geography. But none of the meteorological data from that day indicates conditions that would support such phenomena. The explanation that bothers me most is also the simplest: that Marcus was standing exactly where I think he was standing, looking at exactly what I think he was looking at, but seeing something that I can't see, something that was there for him, but isn't there for me. I've walked past the location where his camera was found hundreds of times since we recovered it, and I always pause to look around to check whether anything has changed or whether I might notice something I missed before. The forest looks the same as it always has, with familiar trees, familiar rock formations, familiar views toward distant ridgelines. But sometimes, usually in late afternoon when the light is similar to what Marcus would have experienced, I find myself scanning the horizon more carefully than necessary, looking for shapes that might resolve into something I haven't seen before. I keep Marcus's final photograph in my office files, and I still look at it occasionally when I'm preparing reports or updating trail maps. Not because I expect to discover new information, but because it reminds me that even places we think we know completely can contain mysteries that resist explanation. 15 years of walking these trails has taught me to read the landscape, to understand its patterns and predict its challenges. But Marcus Chen's final photograph suggests that there might be other ways of seeing the same terrain, other versions of familiar places that become visible under circumstances I don't understand. I still search for him, in a way. Not with organized teams or official protocols, but with the kind of ongoing attention that comes from knowing someone disappeared in country that should have given up its secrets by now. And I still wonder what Marcus saw through his camera that allowed him to capture an image of a place that doesn't exist, or that exists in ways I haven't learned to recognize yet. My name is Dr. Kevin Walsh, and I've been working as a wildlife biologist for the Forest Service in the Olympic Peninsula for 13 years. Most of my work involves population studies and habitat monitoring, spending weeks at a time in remote areas documenting species behavior and ecosystem changes. I know the history of these forests, including the old infrastructure that's been removed or abandoned over the decades. But there's one encounter from last spring that made me question what I actually know about the places I work. It was early May 2023 when I met the Patterson family on the Clearwater Ridge Trail. I was returning from a 3-day field study when I encountered them hiking out toward the trailhead, looking tired but relieved. They were clearly day hikers, light packs, casual gear, the kind of setup that suggests people planning to be back at their car by evening. The weather had been challenging that week, with an unexpected storm system moving through the area that brought heavy rain and strong winds. Not dangerous for experienced outdoors people, but potentially concerning for visitors who might not have anticipated rapidly changing conditions. "Excuse me," the father called out as we crossed paths. "Are you with the Forest Service?" I identified myself and asked if they needed assistance. The family appeared to be in good condition, but they seemed eager to talk to someone official. "We just wanted to thank whoever maintains that old cabin back there," the mother said. "It probably saved our lives when that storm hit yesterday." I was immediately confused. There are no maintained cabins along the Clearwater Ridge Trail system. The area had been thoroughly surveyed during my tenure, and while there are occasional remnants of old structures, nothing that would provide meaningful shelter for visitors. "Which cabin are you referring to?" I asked. The father pointed back along the trail they'd been following. "About 2 miles up, maybe a quarter mile off the main trail to the east. Old Ranger Station. Looks like it's been there for decades." He described the building in detail. A single-room log structure with a metal roof raised slightly off the ground on concrete footings. He mentioned a wood-burning stove, a simple table and chairs, and faded topographical maps mounted on the walls. According to his account, the cabin had provided comfortable shelter during the worst of the previous evening's weather. The description he gave matched perfectly with the old Clearwater Ridge Ranger Station, a structure I knew from historical records and archive photographs. But that cabin had been demolished in 1987, 2 years before I started working in the area. I'd seen the documentation during my initial orientation, including photos of the demolition process and environmental restoration of the site. "Are you sure about the location?" I asked. There haven't been any cabins in that area for quite some time. The family was adamant about what they'd experienced. The teenage daughter added details about the interior layout, describing shelving along one wall and a small collection of emergency supplies. Her younger brother mentioned carved initials in the wooden doorframe and a metal sign beside the entrance. Everything they described was consistent with historical records of the original ranger station, down to specific details that wouldn't be common knowledge unless someone had actually been inside the building. But the building they were describing had been gone for over 30 years. "We took some pictures," the mother said, pulling out her phone. "We thought it was such a charming old place." She attempted to show me the photographs, but the images wouldn't display properly. The screen showed gray static where the photos should have been, with occasional flashes of color that resolved into nothing recognizable. She tried multiple times, even restarting the phone, but the images remained corrupted. "That's strange," she said. "They were displaying fine this morning." I asked if I could examine the phone, thinking there might be a technical issue I could help resolve. The device appeared to be functioning normally for all other applications, but the specific photographs from their cabin experience showed only digital noise. The family was clearly frustrated by the technical problem, but they didn't seem to doubt their own experience. They'd spent several hours in the cabin, had detailed memories of the space and were genuinely grateful for the shelter it had provided during an uncomfortable night outdoors. I accompanied them back toward the trailhead, continuing to ask questions about their experience. Their story remained consistent throughout our conversation, with each family member adding details that supported the other's accounts. They described arriving at the cabin just as the storm intensified, finding the door unlocked, and spending the night on sleeping bags spread across the wooden floor. According to their timeline, they'd discovered the cabin around 7 p.m. and had left that morning around 9, which would account for roughly 14 hours spent in the building. That was more than enough time to develop detailed impressions of the space and its contents. When we reached the parking area, I helped them load their gear and provided them with contact information in case they experienced any delayed effects from their exposure to challenging weather. They thanked me again for the Forest Service's maintenance of the cabin and drove away, apparently satisfied with their wilderness experience despite the unexpected storm. After they left, I hiked back to the location they described, following the trail to the approximate area where they claimed to have found shelter. I knew the terrain well from my research work, and I was familiar with the site where the old ranger station had once stood. The original cabin location was marked only by subtle changes in vegetation and a few concrete footings that were barely visible beneath decades of forest regrowth. No structure had stood there for 36 years, and there was no evidence of recent human activity or temporary shelter construction. I spent several hours searching the surrounding area, looking for any building or structure that might explain the family's experience. There were no other cabins, lean-tos, or significant remnants of old construction within a reasonable distance of the main trail. Over the following days, I researched the Patterson family's account more thoroughly, reviewing historical records and consulting with colleagues who had longer tenure in the area. The details they'd provided about the cabin's interior and exterior features were remarkably accurate when compared to archive photographs and maintenance records from the 1970s and 80s. Most concerning was their description of the topographical maps on the walls. According to historical records, the original ranger station had displayed a specific series of survey maps from 1974 showing trail systems and geographical features that had been updated multiple times since then. The family's description of these maps was consistent with the archived versions, including details about color coding and notations that wouldn't be found on contemporary maps. I contacted the regional office to ask about any recent cabin construction or restoration projects in the Clearwater Ridge area. No such projects had been authorized or completed, and there were no plans for rebuilding historical structures in that location. The more I investigated, the more puzzling the family's experience became. They had described, in accurate detail, spending a night in a building that no longer existed, and they had attempted to document their experience with photographs that couldn't be displayed. About a month later, I was contacted by another wildlife biologist who had heard about the incident through professional networks. She mentioned that similar reports had occasionally surfaced over the years, visitors claiming to have found shelter in cabins or structures that were no longer present in their claimed locations. It's usually dismissed as confusion about locations or mistaken identification of existing buildings, she told me. But the details are sometimes too specific to explain away easily. She provided me with documentation of 3 other incidents over the past decade, all involving visitors who reported staying in buildings that matched historical structures but couldn't be located during follow-up investigations. In each case, the visitors provided accurate descriptions of demolished or relocated facilities, and in 2 cases, they had attempted to photograph their experience with similar technical difficulties. This information suggested that the Patterson family's experience might be part of a larger pattern, though none of the incidents had been investigated systematically or documented in official reports. I began paying closer attention to visitor reports involving unexpected shelter or unfamiliar structures during my routine fieldwork. Over the following year, I encountered 2 other families who mentioned discovering buildings that didn't match any current Forest Service infrastructure, though neither claimed to have stayed overnight or provided the level of detail that the Pattersons had offered. The scientific part of my training suggests several possible explanations for these reports. Memory can be unreliable, especially during stressful situations like unexpected storms. People might conflate different experiences or locations, creating composite memories that don't correspond to actual events. Group psychology can reinforce shared misconceptions, leading entire families to believe they experienced something that didn't actually happen. But the Patterson family's account doesn't fit neatly into any of these explanations. Their description was too detailed, too consistent, and too historically accurate to dismiss as simple confusion or fabrication. They had no apparent motive for creating a false story, and their gratitude for the shelter they'd found seemed genuine. The corrupted photographs bother me most of all. Technical failures can occur with digital devices, especially in challenging outdoor conditions. But the specific nature of the failure images that showed only static when displaying a particular subject suggests something more complex than routine equipment malfunction. I've returned to the old cabin site dozens of times since meeting the Patterson family, often during weather conditions similar to what they experienced. I've documented the area thoroughly, photographed the remnant foundation elements, and confirmed that no structure of any kind exists there currently. But sometimes, especially during late afternoon or evening hours, I find myself looking more carefully at the area than my research requires. Not because I expect to see a cabin that I know isn't there, but because I wonder about the nature of the experience that 4 people shared and remembered so clearly. 13 years of fieldwork has taught me to trust observable evidence and documented fact. The old Clearwater Ridge Ranger Station was demolished in 1987, and no similar structure has been built in that location since then. But the Patterson family's experience suggests that there might be aspects of these places that persist beyond physical removal, or that become accessible under circumstances I don't understand. I still encounter visitors occasionally who mention finding unexpected shelter or unfamiliar buildings during their outdoor experiences. I listen to their accounts more carefully now, and I document details that might seem irrelevant to immediate safety concerns, but could contribute to understanding patterns that extend beyond individual incidents. The Forest Service maintains detailed records of all structures within our jurisdiction, both current and historical. But I've started wondering if there might be other kinds of records, other ways that places remember what once stood there, even after the physical evidence has been cleared away. 2 years later, I still work the same research areas and encounter the same spectrum of visitor experiences that define wilderness recreation. But I've never forgotten the Patterson family's detailed description of a night spent in a cabin that couldn't have been there, and I've never stopped wondering what they actually experienced during that storm on Clearwater Ridge. My name is Rosa Martinez, and I've been supervising trail maintenance for the Redwood Creek Recreation Area for 16 years. In that time, I've overseen every kind of forest management activity you can imagine: planned logging operations, emergency tree removal, habitat restoration projects. I know the sound that chainsaws make echoing through these hills. I know the paperwork required for any tree removal, and I know what authorized forestry work looks like when it's done properly. But there's something I found 2 years ago that doesn't fit any of those categories, and it still bothers me every time I think about it. It was early October 2022 when I was conducting my monthly inspection of the Outer Loop trails. These are less traveled routes that wind through old-growth sections about 4 miles from the main visitor center. We maintain them for experienced hikers who want to see the more remote parts of the forest, but they don't get heavy use, which means problems can develop without being immediately noticed. I was checking trail conditions along the Fern Creek path when I noticed what looked like increased sunlight filtering through the canopy ahead. That usually indicates either storm damage or some kind of clearing. So I left the main trail to investigate. What I found was 37 mature Douglas fir trees cut down in a perfect circle, roughly 40 feet in diameter. Each tree had been felled with clean, professional chainsaw cuts, the kind of work that takes skill and proper equipment. The trees had been dropped so they fell outward from the center, creating a spoke pattern that was geometrically precise. The first thing that struck me was how recent the work appeared to be. The cut surfaces showed fresh wood, with no weathering or discoloration, suggesting the trees had been removed within the past few days. But I hadn't received any notifications about authorized tree removal in that area, and our permit system requires advance approval for any forestry operations on public land. I walked the perimeter of the circle, examining each cut. The chainsaw work was remarkably consistent. Every cut showed the same clean technique, the same angle, the same depth. Whoever had done this work knew what they were doing and had access to professional-grade equipment. But what really puzzled me was the silence. Cutting down 37 mature trees would require hours of chainsaw operation, generating noise that would carry for miles through the forest. Our office is only about 6 miles from that location, and we maintain radio contact with trail crews throughout the area. Nobody had reported hearing chainsaw activity, and we hadn't authorized any contractors to work in that sector. The center of the circle was completely clear, not just of trees, but of all vegetation. The ground was bare soil, smooth and level, as if it had been carefully prepared for some specific purpose. No stumps were visible, suggesting that whoever had done this work had also removed the root systems, which would require additional equipment and considerably more time. I spent about an hour documenting the scene, taking photographs and measurements, trying to understand what kind of operation could have created such precise results without anyone noticing. The logistics alone seemed impossible. Accessing that location would require hiking equipment several miles through forest, with no vehicle access, then operating loud machinery for extended periods without being detected. I radioed back to headquarters to report what I'd found, and within a few hours, we had a team investigating the site. Our district supervisor came out personally, along with a law enforcement officer and a forestry specialist who could assess the technical aspects of the tree removal. The forestry specialist was particularly puzzled by the quality of the work. "This is professional-level cutting," he told us. "Whoever did this has serious experience with chainsaw operation and forest management, but the pattern doesn't serve any practical purpose that I can identify." The law enforcement officer was concerned about trespassing and unauthorized resource extraction. Removing 37 mature trees from public land without permits constitutes a significant violation, potentially involving thousands of dollars in penalties. But when he tried to reconstruct how the operation might have been conducted, he ran into the same logistical problems that had bothered me. "You'd need a crew of at least 3 or 4 people to do this efficiently," he said. "Multiple chainsaws, probably some heavy equipment for stump removal, definitely vehicles for transporting tools and personnel. But there's no access road within 2 miles of here, and we haven't had any reports of unusual activity." We expanded the investigation over the following days, interviewing nearby residents and checking with local contractors who might have the equipment and expertise for this kind of work. Nobody had heard chainsaw activity during the time frame when the trees must have been cut, and no commercial operators had any record of working in that area. The tree removal appeared to have occurred sometime between my previous monthly inspection and the day I discovered it, which narrowed the window to about 4 weeks. But even accounting for that time span, someone should have noticed the noise and activity required for such an extensive operation. What bothered me most was finding the trees themselves. 37 mature Douglas firs represent significant timber value, but we couldn't locate where they'd been taken. The trees had been cut into sections, but those sections weren't left at the site, and we found no evidence of how they might have been transported out of the area. A thorough search of surrounding forest revealed no hidden stockpiles, no drag marks indicating where heavy logs might have been moved, no access routes that could accommodate the vehicles necessary for removing that much timber. The trees had simply vanished, along with whoever had cut them down. The investigation continued for several weeks, but eventually it had to be classified as an unsolved case of resource theft. The paperwork was filed, the site was documented for insurance purposes, and we increased patrols in the area to watch for any additional unauthorized activity. But over the following months, something else started bothering me about that circular clearing. During my regular trail inspections, I began noticing that no new vegetation was growing in the center area where the trees had been removed. Normally, forest clearings experience rapid regrowth, especially in our climate, where rainfall and soil conditions support vigorous plant life. Within a few months, you'd expect to see seedlings, ground cover, and the kind of diverse vegetation that colonizes disturbed areas. But the center of that circle remained bare. I consulted with our district botanist about the lack of regrowth. She visited the site and took soil samples, thinking there might be some chemical contamination or physical condition preventing plant establishment. But the lab results showed normal soil chemistry and biology, with no obvious factors that would inhibit vegetation growth. It's like the ground is rejecting plant life, she told me. But I can't find any scientific reason why that would be happening. The perimeter of the circle, where the trees had been cut, showed normal forest recovery. New shoots were emerging from the remaining root systems, and understory plants were expanding into the increased sunlight. But the center remained stubbornly barren, a perfect circle of empty earth surrounded by recovering forest. I started visiting the site more frequently than my official duties required, partly to monitor the unusual vegetation patterns, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important about what had happened there. During one of these visits, about 8 months after the initial discovery, I found evidence that other people had been coming to look at the circle. Footprints around the perimeter, small pieces of litter, the kind of signs that indicate visitors who aren't necessarily following established trails. I mentioned this to some of my colleagues and learned that word about the circular clearing had spread through informal networks. Hikers were making special trips to see it, drawn by stories about the mysterious tree removal and the area where nothing would grow. People like mysteries, one of my crew leaders told me, especially ones that don't have obvious explanations. But the increased visitor attention made me more protective of the site, not less. Something about the way people talked about the circle bothered me. The tendency to treat it as a curiosity rather than the scene of what was essentially a crime. 2 years have passed since I first discovered those 37 cut trees, and the center of the circle remains barren. We've tried seeding it with native plants, transplanting seedlings from nearby areas, even bringing in topsoil from other parts of the forest. Nothing takes root there. The case officially remains open but inactive. We never identified who cut down the trees or how they managed to remove them without being detected. No similar incidents have occurred in our district, and no new evidence has emerged that might explain the original tree removal. But I still patrol that area regularly, and I still find myself paying closer attention to the circle than my job responsibilities require. Not because I expect to solve the mystery, but because I've never been able to accept that something so precise and deliberate could happen in forest I've been responsible for, without leaving any trail of evidence. The geometric perfection of the cut pattern bothers me most of all. 37 trees, dropped in exactly the right sequence, to create a perfect spoke pattern, with mathematical precision that would challenge professional surveyors. That level of planning and execution suggests knowledge and purpose that go beyond simple resource theft. Sometimes I wonder if the barren center is the point, not just a side effect of the tree removal. Like the trees were cut specifically to create that empty space, and whoever did it knew that nothing would grow there afterward. 16 years of trail maintenance work has taught me that forests are resilient and adaptive, capable of recovering from almost any disturbance given enough time. But this one circular area seems to exist outside those natural patterns, maintained in its emptiness by something I don't understand. I still file my monthly reports on the site, documenting the continuing absence of vegetation and noting any changes in visitor activity. But the reports feel increasingly inadequate, like I'm trying to describe something that resists conventional documentation. 2 years later, I still drive past that trail entrance more slowly than necessary. Still find myself listening for chainsaw sounds that never come. Still wondering who could have moved 37 trees through dense forest without leaving any trace of how they did it. My name is Bill Hayward, and I've been a district supervisor for the National Park Service in the Sierra Nevada region for 22 years. I've managed search and rescue operations, coordinated multi-agency responses, and supervised dozens of rangers through challenging situations that test both professional skills and personal resilience. But there's one incident from 18 months ago that ended a partnership I'd maintained for 8 years and left me with questions I still can't answer. Emma Valdez had been my patrol partner since 2015. She was methodical, experienced, someone who understood that ranger work requires both independence and reliable communication. In 8 years of working together, she'd never missed a scheduled radio check-in, never failed to follow established protocols, never given me reason to worry about her judgment or safety awareness. The incident occurred on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. Emma was conducting a routine patrol of the Devil's Creek watershed, an area that includes about 12 square miles of mixed terrain, dense forest, rocky outcroppings, several seasonal streams, and a network of trails that see moderate recreational use during warmer months. Her radio schedule called for check-ins every 2 hours, standard procedure for solo patrol work in remote areas. The first 2 contacts came through normally 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., with Emma reporting typical early season conditions and no unusual visitor activity. At 10:37, she radioed with an unscheduled communication. "Bill, I'm seeing something odd near the Upper Devil's Creek Trail junction. Going to investigate and report back." I acknowledged her transmission and asked for more details about what she was observing. But Emma had already signed off, apparently focused on whatever had caught her attention. When noon came without her scheduled check-in, I tried raising her on the radio. No response. I attempted contact again at 12:15 and 12:30, with the same result. By 1 p.m., I was actively concerned about her silence. Emma's failure to respond could have several explanations: equipment malfunction, terrain that blocked radio signals, an emergency situation that prevented communication. But her last transmission had suggested she was investigating something, which meant she might have encountered circumstances that required immediate attention. I notified headquarters and initiated a welfare check protocol. Emma's patrol route was well defined, and her last known position near the Devil's Creek Trail junction was accessible by vehicle for part of the approach. I could reach that area within an hour if weather and road conditions cooperated. The drive to the Devil's Creek access point gave me time to consider what Emma might have encountered that would warrant investigation. Early season patrols often involve checking for storm damage, documenting wildlife activity, and ensuring that trail infrastructure had survived winter conditions. But none of those routine observations would typically prompt unscheduled radio contact. I reached the trailhead around 2:15 and immediately spotted Emma's patrol truck parked in the designated area. The vehicle appeared normal, properly positioned, doors locked, no signs of disturbance. But Emma was nowhere visible in the immediate vicinity. I called out for her, thinking she might be conducting work within hearing distance of the parking area. No response. I tried her radio again, both on our regular channel and on the emergency frequency. Still no contact. The trail system near Devil's Creek includes several route options, but Emma's patrol plan had specified the Upper Junction area, which was about 1.5 miles from the trailhead. I began hiking in that direction, continuing to call for her and monitoring radio channels for any transmission. The weather was clear and mild, good conditions for both hiking and radio communication. The terrain along the trail offered reasonable sightlines, and Emma should have been able to hear me calling from a significant distance. I reached the Upper Trail Junction around 3 p.m. without finding any sign of Emma or evidence of what she might have been investigating. The area appeared typical for early season conditions: some fallen branches from winter storms, muddy sections where snowmelt had created drainage issues, but nothing that would obviously warrant special attention. I expanded my search pattern, covering side trails and checking areas where Emma might have diverted from her planned route. By 5 p.m., I had covered most of the accessible terrain within a reasonable radius of her last known position, but found no trace of her presence. I called for additional search resources, and by early evening we had a coordinated operation underway. Search teams covered all established trails in the Devil's Creek watershed, while helicopter support provided aerial reconnaissance of areas that would be difficult to reach on foot. The search continued through the night and into the following day. We brought in tracking dogs, expanded the search perimeter to include areas outside the original patrol zone, and coordinated with local emergency services to check for any incidents that might explain Emma's disappearance. 18 hours after her last radio transmission, one of our search teams found Emma sitting beside her patrol truck in the parking area where I'd started looking for her the previous afternoon. She was conscious, appeared physically uninjured, but seemed disoriented and confused about her surroundings. Emma? I approached carefully, not sure what condition she might be in. Where have you been? We've been searching for you since yesterday afternoon. She looked at me with genuine puzzlement. Yesterday afternoon? What time is it now? I told her it was early Thursday morning, and explained that she'd been missing for nearly 18 hours since her last radio contact on Tuesday. Emma listened to this information with the kind of careful attention someone gives to facts that don't match their understanding of reality. I remember starting patrol Tuesday morning, she said slowly. I remember the regular check-ins. But then she paused, clearly trying to access memories that weren't available. I don't remember what happened after that. The medical team evaluated Emma thoroughly, checking for signs of injury, exposure, or medical conditions that might explain her memory loss and extended absence. They found no obvious physical problems. She was well hydrated, showed no signs of hypothermia or exhaustion, and had no injuries consistent with spending a night outdoors in challenging condition. But Emma's memory of the missing 18 hours remained completely blank. She couldn't recall what she'd been investigating, where she'd gone after her last radio transmission, or how she'd spent the time between Tuesday afternoon and Thursday morning when we found her. The psychological evaluation suggested that Emma was experiencing retrograde amnesia, possibly related to trauma or stress. But without knowing what had happened during her missing time, it was impossible to identify what might have triggered such a response. Emma was placed on administrative leave while the incident was investigated, and she received medical clearance to return to duty. But during the weeks that followed, it became clear that something fundamental had changed about her approach to ranger work. She seemed reluctant to discuss the incident, not defensively but with the kind of careful avoidance that suggested the topic was deeply uncomfortable for her. When I asked about her memory of the missing time, she would say simply that she didn't remember and would prefer not to speculate about what might have happened. More concerning was her apparent loss of enthusiasm for patrol work. Emma had always been someone who enjoyed the independence and variety of ranger duties, but now she seemed to approach even routine tasks with visible reluctance. I keep feeling like I'm forgetting something important, she told me during one of our conversations. Not about the missing time, but about something I'm supposed to be watching for. About 6 weeks after the incident, Emma submitted paperwork requesting early retirement. She had enough years of service to qualify, but the timing surprised everyone who worked with her. Emma was only 41, still young enough for decades of additional ranger work, and had never previously expressed interest in leaving the service. I tried to discuss her decision with her, thinking there might be work-related concerns I could address or support she needed that wasn't being provided. But Emma was firm about her choice to retire. I don't think I'm effective in this job anymore, she said. I can't explain why, but I don't trust my judgment about what's normal and what isn't. Emma's retirement was processed within a few months, and she moved out of the area shortly afterward. I tried to maintain contact with her, partly as a friend, and partly because I never felt like the investigation into her disappearance had been completed satisfactorily. But Emma stopped returning my calls and emails, not with any apparent hostility, but with the kind of finality that suggests someone who's chosen to close a chapter of their life completely. The official incident report concluded that Emma had experienced some kind of medical episode that resulted in temporary memory loss and disorientation. Without additional evidence about what had happened during her missing time, the investigation couldn't determine specific causes or circumstances. But I've never been satisfied with that explanation. Emma was an experienced ranger who understood survival protocols and communication procedures. If she'd become lost or injured, she would have known how to signal for help, or at least leave signs that search teams could follow. The fact that she reappeared at her patrol truck in the same location where I'd started looking for her suggests that she'd returned there deliberately. But if she'd been capable of finding her way back to the vehicle, why hadn't she been able to respond to radio calls or make contact during the 18 hours she was missing? I've continued working the Devil's Creek patrol area since Emma's retirement, partly because it's within my district responsibility, and partly because I'm still curious about what she might have been investigating that Tuesday afternoon. I've paid particular attention to the Upper Trail Junction, where she was heading when she made her last transmission. The area shows no obvious features that would warrant special investigation. Seasonal changes, wildlife activity, and occasional visitor use create the kind of routine variations that experienced rangers learn to assess quickly. Nothing I've observed there explains what caught Emma's attention or what happened to her afterward. But sometimes, usually in late afternoon, when the light is similar to what Emma would have experienced that day, I find myself paying closer attention to details that might seem insignificant: unusual sound patterns, changes in wildlife behavior, or visual anomalies that might warrant investigation. I've never encountered anything that seems worth an unscheduled radio report, but I've started understanding why Emma might have stopped at the Upper Trail Junction that Tuesday afternoon. There's something about that particular location that draws attention, even when nothing obviously unusual is occurring. 18 months have passed since Emma's disappearance and retirement, and I still cover her former patrol areas as part of my regular duties. But I've never forgotten the careful way she avoided discussing what happened during those missing 18 hours, or the resignation in her voice when she said she couldn't trust her judgment anymore. The Devil's Creek watershed remains one of the most peaceful sections of our district, popular with hikers who appreciate its combination of accessibility and solitude. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that something happened there that changed Emma's relationship to ranger work so completely that retirement seemed like her only option. 22 years of district supervision has taught me that ranger work involves constant assessment of risk and uncertainty. But Emma's case represents a different kind of uncertainty: the possibility that there are experiences in these places that resist explanation and leave people fundamentally changed in ways they can't articulate. I still drive past the Devil's Creek trailhead more slowly than necessary, still find myself looking for Emma's patrol truck, even though I know she's been retired for over a year. And I still wonder what she encountered during those missing 18 hours that made her decide she could never trust her judgment as a ranger again. My name is Tony Valdez, and I've been coordinating search and rescue operations in the Angeles National Forest for 19 years. I've managed searches for lost hikers, missing children, and people who've made poor decisions in challenging terrain. Most cases end with successful recovery and relief all around, but some leave you with questions that follow you home. There's one rescue from last summer that still bothers me, not because we failed, but because of what the child told us about who he'd been with in the woods. It was early August 2023 when we received the call about 7-year-old Michael Reeves. His family had been camping at Buckhorn Campground, and Michael had wandered away from their site sometime in the mid-afternoon while his parents were setting up their tent. When they realized he was missing around 4 p.m., they'd searched the immediate area before calling for professional help. The initial response was routine for a missing child case. We established a search perimeter around the campground, organized volunteer teams to cover established trails, and brought in a helicopter unit for aerial reconnaissance. Michael had been missing for about 3 hours when we arrived, which is concerning but not yet critical for a child his age in summer weather conditions. Michael's parents provided us with details about his clothing, physical description, and behavioral patterns that might help predict where he'd gone. He was wearing a blue t-shirt and khaki shorts, was generally obedient but curious about wildlife, and had no previous experience with wilderness areas that would give him survival skills. The search area around Buckhorn Campground includes dense forest, several seasonal creeks, and a network of informal trails created by decades of recreational use. It's terrain where a child could easily become disoriented, but also terrain where someone calling his name should be able to locate him within a reasonable time frame. We spent the first 4 hours conducting systematic coverage of the area within a half-mile radius of the campground. Standard protocol for missing children assumes they won't travel far from their last known location, especially if they realize they're lost and are trying to find their way back. But as evening approached, without finding Michael, we expanded the search perimeter and brought in additional resources. Night searches for missing children require careful coordination. You need enough searchers to cover the terrain thoroughly, but not so many that you risk additional people becoming lost or injured in challenging conditions. Around 11 p.m., one of our tracking teams picked up signs that appeared to be from a child's footprints leading away from the campground area toward a more remote section of forest. The prints were faint and intermittent, but they suggested Michael had traveled much farther than we'd initially expected. We focused our night search efforts along the probable route indicated by the tracks, using floodlights and maintaining constant radio communication to ensure searcher safety. The terrain became increasingly difficult as we moved away from established recreation areas, with steeper slopes and denser vegetation that would challenge even experienced hikers. At 2:37 a.m., we heard a child's voice responding to our calls. The sound came from an area about 1.5 miles from the campground, in a section of forest that would have required significant effort for a 7-year-old to reach on his own. We found Michael sitting beside a fallen log, apparently uninjured but clearly tired from his extended time outdoors. He seemed calm when he saw our lights, not displaying the fear or relief you'd typically expect from a lost child who'd spent 10 hours alone in the wilderness. "Michael?" I approached him carefully, keeping my voice gentle and reassuring. "We're here to help you get back to your mom and dad. Are you hurt?" He looked at me with the kind of serious expression that seems unusual on young children. "I'm not lost," he said. "I was visiting my other family, but they said I had to go back now." I assumed he was referring to other campers he might have encountered, possibly people who had helped him after he became separated from his parents. "Can you tell me about the people you were with? We should thank them for taking care of you." Michael nodded earnestly. "Grandma Rose and Grandpa Jim. They were so happy to see me. They said they'd been waiting for me to visit them." I radioed to confirm we'd found Michael and were beginning transport back to the campground. As we started hiking out, I continued talking with him to assess his condition and gather information about his experience. "Where did you meet your grandma and grandpa?" I asked. "In the quiet place," Michael said. "They have a house there, but it's hard to see unless you know where to look." Children often have vivid imaginations, especially after stressful experiences, so I didn't place much significance on his description of an invisible house. But I was curious about the people he'd mentioned, thinking we should contact them to verify that Michael had been safe during his time away from the campground. "Can you tell me more about Grandma Rose and Grandpa Jim?" I said. "What did they look like?" Michael provided remarkably detailed descriptions. Grandma Rose had gray hair that she wore in a bun, wore a blue dress with small flowers on it, and had a scar on her left hand from when she'd cut herself cooking. Grandpa Jim was tall and thin, wore suspenders and a white shirt, and had a mustache that tickled when he gave hugs. The level of detail was impressive for a 7-year-old, and Michael spoke about these people with the kind of familiarity that comes from genuine relationship, not imagination. When we reached the campground around 4 a.m., Michael's parents were waiting with obvious relief and exhaustion. The reunion was emotional, but brief. They wanted to get Michael checked by medical personnel and then return home as quickly as possible. But during the medical evaluation, Michael continued talking about his experience with his grandparent. He told the paramedic that Grandma Rose had given him cookies and that Grandpa Jim had shown him how to identify different bird calls. He seemed disappointed that he'd had to leave them, but said they'd promised he could visit again sometime. Michael's father overheard these comments and became visibly uncomfortable. He asked to speak with me privately while the medical team finished their assessment. "The people Michael's describing," he said quietly, "those are my parents, Rose and James Reeves. But they died in a car accident 3 years ago, when Michael was 4. I asked if Michael might be remembering visits with his grandparents from before their deaths, possibly conflating those memories with his recent experience in the forest. But Michael's father shook his head. "He's describing things he couldn't possibly know," he said. "The scar on my mother's hand, my father's mustache. Michael was too young to remember those details, and we don't have many photographs from that period." The medical evaluation found Michael to be in good condition, showing no signs of dehydration, exposure, or injury, despite spending 10 hours outdoors. He was alert, responsive, and seemed emotionally stable, not displaying trauma symptoms you might expect from a frightening experience. But as we prepared to close out the incident report, Michael approached me with one final comment. "Tony," he said, apparently having remembered my name from our conversation during the hike-out. "Grandma Rose wanted me to tell you something." "What's that, Michael?" "She said to tell you that the quiet place is real, and that families don't really end when people think they do." I thanked Michael for the message, though I wasn't sure what to make of it. Children often process difficult experiences through symbolic language that doesn't necessarily correspond to literal events. But over the following days, I found myself thinking about Michael's account more than I usually would about routine search and rescue operations. The consistency of his descriptions, his apparent comfort with the experience, and the specific details he'd provided about people who had died before he could have formed clear memories of them. About a week after the rescue, I contacted Michael's family to follow up on his recovery and see if there were any delayed effects from his night in the wilderness. But when I called the number they'd provided, I discovered it had been disconnected. I checked with the campground registration system and learned that the Reeves family had cut short their camping trip and left the area the day after Michael's rescue. According to the records, they'd indicated they were moving out of state and wouldn't be returning to the Angeles National Forest. This seemed like an unusually strong reaction to what had ultimately been a successful search and rescue operation. Most families who experience incidents like Michael's are grateful for the positive outcome and return to normal recreational activities without significant changes to their lifestyle. I tried contacting them through other means, but the family appeared to have severed their connections to the area completely. Their previous address showed they'd moved out of state, and attempts to reach them through family social networks were unsuccessful. The incident report was filed as a routine successful recovery, with no notation about the unusual aspects of Michael's account of his missing time. There didn't seem to be any official category for documenting a child's claims about visiting deceased relatives in the wilderness. But I've never forgotten Michael's calm certainty about his experience, or his father's obvious discomfort when he realized who Michael was describing. Most 7-year-olds who spend 10 hours lost in the forest would remember being scared, hungry, or lonely. Michael remembered being visited by grandparents who had died 3 years earlier. Over the following months, I paid more attention to the area where we'd found Michael, particularly during other search operations in that section of forest. Its typical Angeles National Forest terrain, dense, mixed woodland, seasonal water sources, the kind of environment that challenges searchers but doesn't usually present unusual features. But sometimes, especially during late evening or early morning hours when visibility is limited, I find myself scanning the area more carefully than operational necessity requires. Not because I expect to see anything unusual, but because I remember Michael's description of a quiet place, where families continue to exist after other people think they've ended. 19 years of search and rescue work has taught me that people process traumatic experiences in different ways, and that children especially can create elaborate narratives to cope with frightening situations. Michael's account of visiting his deceased grandparents could represent his mind's way of managing the stress of being lost and alone in unfamiliar terrain. But the family's immediate departure from the area, their disconnection of contact information, and their apparent decision to leave California entirely suggests that Michael's experience was disturbing to them in ways that extend beyond concern about his physical safety. I still coordinate searches in the same section of forest where we found Michael, and I still encounter families camping at Buckhorn Campground who are dealing with minor emergencies and routine outdoor challenges. But I've never had another case involving a child who claimed to have spent time with relatives who had died years earlier. Sometimes I wonder what Michael's parents learned about his experience that made them decide to relocate their entire family away from the Angeles National Forest. And I wonder whether Michael still talks about his visit to the quiet place, or whether his family has convinced him that those memories represent something other than what he thought they were. 2 years later, I still drive past the area where we found Michael more slowly than necessary, still find myself looking into the forest with the kind of attention that comes from remembering someone who was completely certain about an experience that shouldn't have been possible. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been working the night shift as a gate attendant at Redwood State Park for 7 years. It's quiet work that suits me, monitoring the entrance, doing security rounds, making sure nobody enters the park after hours without authorization. The job involves a lot of solitude and routine, but it pays well and gives me time to study during the slow hours. Most nights, nothing happens worth writing a report about. But there's one incident from 6 months ago that I still can't explain, and it's changed how I feel about working alone out here. It was a Tuesday night in early February, 2024, during one of those cold, clear stretches when nobody in their right mind would be camping. The park officially closes at sunset during winter months, and we lock the entrance gate around 6 p.m. After that, it's my job to monitor the facility until morning staff arrives at 7 a.m. The security system includes cameras positioned at the main gate, the parking areas, and several points along the primary access roads. Most of the time, the cameras record nothing more interesting than deer crossing the roads or the occasional maintenance vehicle during emergency calls. Around 3 a.m., I was reviewing the previous day's footage as part of my routine security check when I noticed something unusual on the main gate camera. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., and the footage clearly displayed a man walking past the closed gate, heading into the park on foot. This was immediately concerning for several reasons. First, the gate had been locked since 6 p.m. the previous evening, and I'd been monitoring the entrance all night without seeing anyone approach. Second, entering a state park after hours without authorization is a violation that requires documentation and follow-up. Third, someone hiking alone in the middle of the night during winter conditions could be putting themselves in serious danger. I reviewed the footage more carefully, trying to get a clear view of the individual. The man appeared to be middle-aged, wearing dark clothing, walking with the kind of steady pace that suggested familiarity with the terrain. He passed directly in front of the camera, but the image quality and lighting conditions made it difficult to identify specific facial features or other distinguishing characteristics. What puzzled me most was how he'd gotten past the locked gate. The entrance to Redwood State Park is designed to prevent unauthorized vehicle access, with a substantial metal barrier that extends across the entire roadway. There are pedestrian access points, but they're also secured after hours and would require climbing or bypass techniques that should have been visible on camera. I checked the camera footage from earlier in the evening, looking for any indication of when this person might have entered the park area, but I found no record of anyone approaching the gate or attempting to access the facility between the 6 p.m. closure and the 3:17 a.m. sighting. I completed an incident report and planned to investigate further during my morning rounds. Unauthorized entry is something we take seriously, both for security reasons and because people who enter wilderness areas at night often underestimate the risks involved. When the morning shift supervisor arrived at 7 a.m., I briefed him on what I'd observed and recommended that we search the parking areas for any vehicles that might belong to the unauthorized visitor. If someone had left a car overnight, it would help us identify who had entered the park and potentially locate them if they needed assistance. We found a silver sedan in the main parking area with the engine still running. The car was unlocked, keys in the ignition, with no immediate signs of its owner. The vehicle registration showed it belonged to David Morris, a 43-year-old man from a town about 60 miles away. This discovery raised additional concerns. Leaving a car running overnight suggested either an emergency situation or someone who had planned to return quickly. But David Morris was nowhere visible in the parking area or along the nearby trail access points. We initiated a search of the immediate area, focusing on the trails that would be accessible from the main parking area. It was possible that David had encountered some kind of difficulty during his unauthorized night hike and needed assistance getting back to his vehicle. But after several hours of searching, we found no trace of David Morris anywhere within a reasonable radius of the parking area. No footprints leading away from his car. No personal items dropped along trail routes. No indication of which direction he might have gone after entering the park. The incident was reported to local law enforcement, who took over the investigation as a potential missing person case. They interviewed David's family and associates, looking for information about why he might have entered the park in the middle of the night and whether he had experience with wilderness hiking. According to his family, David had never shown particular interest in outdoor recreation and had no history of hiking or camping. He worked as an accountant, lived alone, and maintained regular routines that didn't include nighttime adventures in state parks. His presence at Redwood State Park was as much a mystery to them as it was to us. The investigation continued for several days, with expanded search teams covering larger areas of the park and adjacent wilderness. But no trace of David Morris was ever found, and he remains missing to this day. What bothered me most about the case was the security footage. As part of the investigation, law enforcement requested copies of all camera recordings from the night David disappeared. I provided them with the files I'd reviewed, including the 3:17 a.m. footage showing someone walking past the entrance gate. But when the investigators examined the footage, they found something that didn't match what I'd observed. According to their review, the camera showed no human figure at the 3:17 a.m. timestamp. The footage displayed the empty gate area, with no indication that anyone had passed through the frame. I reviewed the same footage again, certain that I'd seen someone walking past the camera, but when I looked at the files, they showed exactly what the investigators had described: an empty gate area with no human presence visible. This discrepancy was impossible to explain through normal technical problems. Security cameras can malfunction, recording equipment can fail, and digital files can become corrupted. But I'd seen the figure clearly enough to write an incident report and initiate a search operation. The image had been distinct enough for me to determine the person's approximate age, clothing, and walking pace. Yet the same footage, when reviewed hours later, showed nothing but an empty entrance gate during the time frame when I was certain someone had passed through. The investigators considered the possibility that I'd confused different pieces of footage or misremembered the timestamp when I'd observed the figure. But my incident report had been filed immediately after viewing the footage, and the details I'd recorded were specific enough to rule out general confusion about what I'd seen. They also explored technical explanations for the discrepancy. Computer specialists examined the security system for evidence of tampering, digital manipulation, or equipment malfunction that might account for the changed footage. But they found no indication of technical problems or unauthorized access to the recording system. The case was eventually classified as a missing person investigation, with no clear explanation for David Morris's presence at the park or his subsequent disappearance. The footage discrepancy was noted in the official report, but wasn't considered central to understanding what had happened to him. But for me, the footage issue became more significant than David's disappearance itself. I'd been working security cameras for 7 years, and I understood the difference between technical glitches and clear visual information. What I'd seen that night was a definitive image of someone walking past the entrance gate. The fact that the same footage later showed nothing suggests something about the incident that I still can't comprehend. Over the following months, I've become more attentive to the security footage during my night shifts, particularly during the early morning hours around 3 a.m. I've reviewed hundreds of hours of recordings, looking for any similar anomalies or unexplained visual discrepancies. I've never encountered another incident like the David Morris case, but I've started noticing aspects of the footage that I hadn't paid attention to before. Occasional frames that seem slightly different when reviewed later, shadows that appear and disappear without obvious causes, brief visual artifacts that could be technical problems or could represent something else. Most of these observations can be explained through normal camera operation, environmental factors, or the kind of minor technical issues that affect any electronic surveillance system. But some of them remind me of the discrepancy between what I saw that February night and what the footage showed when investigators reviewed it. I've also become more aware of the parking area during my morning rounds, particularly looking for vehicles that might have been left overnight without authorization. The David Morris case made me realize how easily someone could enter the park after hours and leave evidence of their presence that wouldn't be detected until the following day. But I've never found another running car in the parking area, and I've never again observed someone walking past the entrance gate during overnight hours. The February incident remains unique in my 7 years of night shift work. What continues to bother me most is the certainty of what I saw compared to the absence of corroborating evidence. Security work depends on accurate observation and reliable documentation, but the David Morris case suggests that there might be situations where those principles don't apply in ways I understand. I still file incident reports when I observe unusual activity, and I still maintain the same attention to detail that the job requires. But I've started including more specific technical information about camera timestamps, recording conditions, and file verification procedures. Not because I expect similar discrepancies to occur, but because I want to ensure that future observations can be documented in ways that resist the kind of unexplained changes that occurred with the David Morris footage. 6 months later, I still work the same night shift at the same entrance gate, monitoring the same security cameras and conducting the same routine patrols. But I've never forgotten the confidence I felt when I saw someone walking past that gate at 3:17 a.m., or the confusion I experienced when that same footage showed empty air where a person should have been. David Morris remains missing, his case still open but inactive. His car was eventually returned to his family, who continue to search for explanations about why he would have visited a state park in the middle of the night. But the security footage that should have provided crucial evidence of his final known location shows nothing that helps understand what happened to him. I still drive past the entrance gate more slowly than necessary when I arrive for my shift. Still find myself studying the area where I watched someone walk into the park and disappear from both the physical world and the electronic record of that disappearance. My name is Rachel Kim, and I've been an investigative officer with the Forest Service for 12 years, specializing in incident documentation and evidence collection for cases that occur on federal land. I've processed everything from accidental deaths to complex criminal scenes, and I understand the importance of thorough investigation and proper documentation. But there's one case from 2 years ago that still bothers me, not because of what I found, but because of how quickly it was taken out of my hands. It was late September 2022 when I received the call about a body discovered in the Mount Hood National Forest. A group of day hikers had found what appeared to be a suicide victim hanging from a tree about 3 miles off the main Salmon River Trail. The initial report suggested a straightforward case, a middle-aged man who had taken his own life in a remote location. I arrived at the scene around 2 p.m., accompanied by a deputy from the county sheriff's department and a photographer from the coroner's office. The location was accessible by foot, but required a significant hike through dense forest to reach the area where the body had been discovered. The victim was a white male, approximately 45 years old, wearing hiking clothes that appeared to be several days old. He was suspended from a large Douglas fir tree using climbing rope that had been fashioned into a noose. The scene initially supported the hiking group's assessment that they'd encountered a suicide. But as I began my standard documentation procedures, I noticed details that didn't align with typical suicide presentations. The victim's hands were secured behind his back with zip ties, which would have made it impossible for him to have constructed the hanging apparatus himself. This was immediately concerning. While people who choose to end their lives sometimes bind their own hands to prevent instinctive attempts to save themselves, the zip tie restraints were positioned in a way that suggested they'd been applied by someone else. The angle and tightness indicated external application rather than self-restraint. I documented this observation in my initial notes and continued processing the scene according to standard protocols. I photographed the victim from multiple angles, measured distances and heights, and collected samples of the rope and restraint materials for laboratory analysis. Additional details supported the possibility that this was not a suicide. There was no suicide note found at the scene or in the victim's pockets. No personal effects had been left nearby, in the deliberate arrangement that people sometimes create when they plan to take their own lives. No evidence of the kind of preparation and planning that typically precedes suicide in remote locations. Most significantly, the rope configuration suggested knowledge of climbing and rigging techniques that went beyond basic knot-tying skills. The anchor points and weight distribution showed understanding of load-bearing principles that would be unusual for someone whose primary goal was simply ending their life. I completed my scene documentation and evidence collection over about 4 hours, taking care to record everything that might be relevant to determining how and why this person had died in this location. Based on my observations, I plan to recommend that the case be investigated as a potential homicide rather than suicide. The victim's identification showed his name was Thomas Brennan, a software engineer from Portland who had no known history of mental health issues or suicidal behavior. His family reported that he'd been planning a solo hiking trip, but hadn't specified his intended destination or expected return date. But when I returned to the office the following day to begin preparing my formal report, I was informed that the case had been transferred to a different jurisdiction and that my involvement was no longer required. This was unusual for federal land cases, which typically remain under Forest Service investigation, unless specific circumstances warrant transfer. I asked my supervisor about the jurisdictional change and was told that higher authorities had determined the case fell under different investigative protocols. When I requested clarification about which agency was taking over the investigation, I was told that information would be provided through appropriate channels. Over the following weeks, I attempted to follow up on the Thomas Brennan case through normal administrative processes, but I encountered consistent resistance to my inquiries, with different supervisors telling me that the case was being handled by other agencies and that my continued interest was not necessary. This response was unlike anything I'd experienced in 12 years of investigative work. Federal land deaths typically involve extensive documentation, interagency coordination, and clear chains of communication about investigative responsibility. The Thomas Brennan case seemed to have disappeared into administrative procedures that I couldn't access or understand. About 2 months later, I learned through informal channels that the case had been officially closed with a determination of undetermined circumstances. This classification is typically used when evidence is insufficient to establish a clear cause and manner of death, but it seemed inappropriate for a case where physical evidence clearly contradicted suicide. I requested access to the final case file through Freedom of Information procedures, thinking I might be able to understand what additional investigation had occurred after my involvement ended. But my request was denied on grounds of ongoing investigative sensitivity, despite the case having been officially closed. The administrative response to my inquiries was more disturbing to me than the original scene I'd processed. Thomas Brennan's death involved clear evidence of external involvement: the bound hands, the sophisticated rope work, the absence of suicidal indicators. Yet the case had been closed without apparent consideration of these factors. I began paying more attention to other cases that involved unusual deaths on federal land, wondering if the Thomas Brennan investigation represented part of a larger pattern of administrative irregularities. But I found no similar instances of cases being transferred away from Forest Service investigation or closed through processes I couldn't access. Over the following year, I continued to encounter references to the case in administrative contexts that I couldn't fully understand. Mentions in budget documents, personnel communications, and training materials that suggested the case had ongoing significance beyond its official closure. Most concerning were occasional comments from colleagues who seemed to know more about the case than I did, despite my having been the primary investigative officer at the scene. References to special circumstances and external agency involvement that implied knowledge of investigative details I'd never been provided. I began to suspect that Thomas Brennan's death was connected to activities or circumstances that extended beyond the apparent facts of his case. The level of administrative control over information, the unusual jurisdictional transfers, and the resistance to normal investigative procedures suggested involvement of agencies or interests that operated outside typical Forest Service protocols. But I could never identify specific connections or establish concrete evidence of what those external factors might have been. The case remained officially closed, with a determination that satisfied administrative requirements but left fundamental questions unanswered. What bothered me most was the contradiction between the physical evidence I'd documented and the official conclusion that had been reached. I'd spent 4 hours at that scene, photographing and measuring and collecting samples that clearly indicated Thomas Brennan had not died by suicide. Yet the case had been closed in a way that ignored those findings. I started keeping more detailed personal records of my investigative work, documenting not just the physical evidence, but also the administrative processes that followed. Not because I expected to encounter similar cases, but because I wanted to ensure that future investigations couldn't be redirected or concluded without my understanding what was happening. 2 years have passed since I processed the Thomas Brennan scene, and I've continued working similar cases throughout the Mount Hood National Forest. I've investigated accidental deaths, documented crime scenes, and processed evidence according to the same protocols I used in Thomas's case. But I've never encountered another situation where my investigation was terminated through administrative procedures I couldn't access, or where a case was closed despite clear evidence that contradicted the official determination. The Thomas Brennan case remains unique in my experience. I still hike through the area where we found Thomas, partly for work-related reasons, and partly because I remain curious about what happened there. The location shows no remaining evidence of the incident. The tree where he was found continues to grow. The forest has returned to its normal patterns, and hikers pass through without any indication of what occurred there 2 years ago. But I've never forgotten the careful way those zip ties had been applied, or the sophisticated rigging that had been used to suspend Thomas from that tree. Someone with specific knowledge and equipment had been responsible for his death, and that person had never been identified or apprehended. The official determination of undetermined circumstances might satisfy administrative requirements, but it doesn't account for the clear evidence of external involvement that I documented at the scene. Someone decided that Thomas Brennan's case should be closed quickly and quietly, and I still wonder who made that decision and why they were in such a hurry to end the investigation. 12 years of investigative work has taught me that some cases resist easy resolution, and that administrative processes sometimes prioritize closure over accuracy. But the Thomas Brennan case represents something different, a deliberate effort to prevent investigation, rather than simply failing to solve a difficult case. I still file my reports according to standard procedures, and I still document evidence with the same attention to detail that the job requires. But I've never forgotten how quickly Thomas Brennan's case was taken away from me, or how efficiently the administrative system can close files when someone with sufficient authority decides that further investigation is not in the public interest. My name is David Price, and I've been working as a backcountry ranger in the Cascade Wilderness for 14 years. I've encountered just about everything you'd expect in remote wilderness work. Lost hikers, weather emergencies, wildlife encounters, and the occasional person who shouldn't be alone in the woods. Most of my job involves routine patrols, campsite monitoring, and helping visitors who've gotten in over their heads. But there's one incident from last summer that still bothers me, not because anyone was hurt, but because of what three strangers told me about the same impossible dream. It was mid-July, 2023, during one of those busy weekend periods when every backcountry campsite is occupied, and I'm spending most of my time checking permits and ensuring people are following wilderness regulations. The weather had been perfect for camping: clear skies, mild temperatures, no significant fire restrictions that would limit campfire use. I was conducting my regular patrol of the Miller Creek Basin, an area that includes about a dozen primitive campsites scattered along a 5-mile section of trail. The sites are popular because they offer good water access and scenic views, but they're remote enough that visitors need to be self-sufficient and prepared for wilderness conditions. My first stop was Campsite 7, where I found an empty site with clear evidence that someone had left in a hurry. The fire ring contained cold ashes from the previous night, but camping gear was scattered around the area in a way that suggested hasty packing rather than organized departure. This isn't uncommon in backcountry camping. People sometimes encounter weather, wildlife, or personal emergencies that require quick departures, but something about the scene suggested more urgency than typical early departure scenario. I continued to Campsite 9, about a mile further along the trail, and found a similar situation. Another empty campsite with evidence of recent occupation, but signs of rapid departure. Personal items left behind, including a camp chair and some cooking equipment that experienced campers wouldn't normally abandon. When I reached Campsite 12 and found the same pattern: cold fire, scattered gear, signs of hurried departure, I started wondering if there had been some kind of emergency situation that had affected multiple camping groups simultaneously. I hiked back toward the trailhead, thinking I might encounter the departed campers on their way out and be able to ask about any problems they'd experienced. Weather conditions had been stable, and I hadn't received any reports of wildlife incidents or other emergencies that might explain why 3 separate camping groups had apparently left the area so quickly. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I encountered the first group, a middle-aged couple from Seattle who had been camping at Site 7. They seemed relieved to see me, but also appeared tired and somewhat shaken. "Everything all right?" I asked. "I noticed you'd left your campsite this morning." The woman looked at her husband before answering. "We had a really disturbing experience last night. We decided it would be better to hike out early rather than spend another night there." I asked them to describe what had happened, thinking they might have encountered a bear or had some other wildlife-related incident that would require follow-up reporting. "It wasn't an animal," the man said. "We both had the same dream, which sounds crazy, but it was so vivid and unsettling that we couldn't stay." He described dreaming about a woman in a red dress who had been standing at the edge of their campsite, just outside the firelight, watching them while they slept. According to his account, the woman hadn't moved or spoken, but her presence had been deeply disturbing in ways he couldn't articulate. "The strangest part," his wife added, "is that we both had exactly the same dream. Every detail matched when we compared what we'd experienced." Shared dreams between couples aren't unknown, especially in stressful or unfamiliar environments where people might be influenced by similar external stimuli. I thanked them for the information and continued hiking toward the trailhead. About an hour later, I encountered a solo camper who had been staying at Site 9. He was a young man from Portland, someone who appeared to have significant outdoor experience and wouldn't normally be rattled by typical wilderness experiences. "Glad to see you," he said when I introduced myself. I was hoping to report something unusual that happened last night. I asked him to describe his experience, expecting to hear about wildlife activity or some other routine backcountry incident. I had this incredibly vivid dream about a woman in a red dress, he said. She was standing right at the edge of my campsite, just watching me. It was so realistic that I woke up several times thinking someone was actually there. The similarity to the previous account was immediately striking. I asked him for more details about the woman's appearance and behavior, and his description matched exactly what the couple from Seattle had told me. I've been camping alone for years, he continued, and I've never had a dream affect me like that. I couldn't get back to sleep, and I decided to pack up and leave as soon as it was light enough to hike safely. By this point, I was beginning to see a pattern that went beyond coincidence. Two separate camping groups, with no apparent connection to each other, had experienced identical dreams about a woman in a red dress, and had both decided to leave the area early as a result. When I reached the trailhead parking area, I found the third group, a family from California, who had been camping at Site 12. They were loading their gear into their vehicle and appeared eager to leave the area. I approached them and asked about their camping experience, using the same casual tone I'd employed with the previous groups. It was really strange, the father said. Our daughter had a nightmare last night that upset her so much we decided to cut the trip short. I asked if he could describe the nightmare, though I was beginning to suspect what his answer would be. She dreamed about a woman in a red dress, standing near our tent, he said. She woke up crying and insisted that the woman was real, that she'd been watching our family while we slept. The daughter, who appeared to be about 12 years old, nodded emphatically when her father described the dream. She was just standing there, the girl said. She didn't move or say anything, but she felt scary. 3 separate camping groups, occupying different sites over several miles of wilderness, had experienced identical dreams about a woman in a red dress. All 3 groups had been sufficiently disturbed by the experience to abandon their camping trips and leave the area early. I spent the rest of that day hiking back through the Miller Creek Basin, looking for any physical evidence that might explain what the campers had experienced. Shared psychological experiences in wilderness settings can sometimes be triggered by environmental factors, unusual sounds, atmospheric conditions, or other stimuli that affect multiple people in similar ways. But I found no obvious explanations for what had happened. Weather conditions had been calm and typical for the season. No unusual wildlife activity. No mechanical sounds from aircraft or distant machinery. No natural phenomena that would account for 3 separate groups having identical disturbing dreams. As I was conducting my final check of Campsite 12, where the family from California had been staying, I noticed something I'd missed during my earlier inspection. A red scarf was tied to a low branch about 20 feet from the camping area, partially concealed by undergrowth. The scarf was made of a thin material that appeared to have been exposed to weather for an extended period. It was faded and weathered, with the kind of deterioration that comes from months or years of outdoor exposure, not something that had been recently placed or abandoned by weekend campers. I removed the scarf and examined it more carefully. The fabric was consistent with clothing from several decades ago, and the condition suggested it had been tied to that branch for much longer than the few days since the camping groups had reported their dreams. But the timing of my discovery, immediately after 3 separate reports of dreams about a woman in a red dress, seemed too coincidental to dismiss. The scarf was the only physical evidence I could find that might relate to the campers' experiences, even though its weathered condition suggested it predated their visits by many years. I filed a report documenting the early departures and the unusual shared dream experiences, though I wasn't sure how to categorize the incident or what follow-up actions might be appropriate. The campers hadn't reported any crimes or safety violations, and their dreams, however unusual, didn't constitute a wilderness emergency. But over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about the incident more than I would normally dwell on routine patrol encounters. The specificity of the shared imagery The identical decision by all three groups to leave early, and the discovery of the red scarf, created a pattern that resisted easy explanation. I researched the history of the Miller Creek Basin, looking for any records of previous incidents or historical events that might relate to the campers' experiences. The area had been used for recreation for decades, but I found no documented incidents involving women in red dresses or any other unusual reports that matched what I'd encountered. I also spoke with other rangers who had worked the area longer than I had, asking if they'd encountered similar reports or had knowledge of local stories that might explain the shared dream phenomenon. Most had no recollection of comparable incidents, though one mentioned occasional reports of unusual dreams from backcountry campers without providing specific details. Over the rest of the summer, I paid particular attention to the Miller Creek Basin during my regular patrols, watching for any additional reports of unusual experiences or early departures that might indicate ongoing problems in the area. I encountered several more camping groups throughout the season, but none reported experiences similar to what had happened in July. The area returned to normal patterns of use, with typical camping activities, and no indication of the unusual psychological phenomena that had affected three separate groups during that one weekend. But I kept the red scarf, partly as evidence and partly because it represented the only tangible connection to an incident that otherwise existed only in the memories of people who had experienced something they couldn't explain. 14 years of backcountry work has taught me that wilderness areas can affect people in unexpected ways. Isolation, unfamiliar environments, and natural phenomena can create psychological experiences that seem supernatural but have rational explanations rooted in human psychology and environmental factors. But the Miller Creek incident challenges that understanding in ways I'm still trying to process. Three unconnected groups experiencing identical dreams, followed by my discovery of physical evidence that predated their visits but matched their shared imagery, suggests patterns that extend beyond individual psychological responses to wilderness conditions. I still patrol the Miller Creek Basin regularly, and I still encounter families and solo campers who use the area for routine wilderness recreation. But I've never forgotten the certainty in that 12-year-old girl's voice when she insisted the woman in the red dress had been real, or the weathered condition of the scarf that shouldn't have been connected to dreams that three separate groups had shared on the same night. 1 year later, I still carry that red scarf in my pack during patrols, not because I expect to encounter similar incidents, but because it reminds me that even places I think I understand completely can contain experiences that resist explanation through normal wilderness management protocols. My name is Janet Mills, and I've been the primary communications officer for Yellowstone's North District for 9 years. I handle emergency calls, coordinate search and rescue operations, and maintain radio contact with rangers throughout some of the most remote wilderness in the country. I've managed communications during blizzards, wildfire evacuations, and complex multi-agency operations. But there's one incident from last autumn that still makes me check our phone logs more carefully than I probably need to. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October 2023, when we received a missing person report for Martin Hendricks, a 52-year-old solo hiker from Denver. His wife had expected him to check in Monday evening, and when she didn't hear from him by Tuesday morning, she contacted our emergency line. Martin was an experienced hiker who had visited Yellowstone many times over the years. His planned route was the Specimen Ridge Trail, a challenging but well-marked 12-mile loop that most experienced hikers can complete in a long day. He'd registered for a backcountry permit and had provided detailed information about his intended timeline and emergency contacts. We initiated a standard search protocol Tuesday afternoon, with ground teams covering the Specimen Ridge Trail and helicopter support providing aerial reconnaissance of the surrounding area. The weather had been clear but cold, with overnight temperatures dropping below freezing, which created urgency around locating Martin before conditions became life-threatening. The search continued through Tuesday evening and into Wednesday morning, without finding any trace of Martin or evidence of where he might have encountered difficulties. His car remained in the trailhead parking area, properly locked, with no signs of disturbance or emergency. Wednesday afternoon, something unusual began appearing in our call logs. According to our phone system records, we were receiving calls from Martin Hendricks' cell phone number every hour on the hour, starting at 2 p.m. But none of these calls were actually coming through to our emergency line. I first noticed the discrepancy when I was reviewing call logs as part of routine communications documentation. The system showed incoming calls from Martin's number, but I had no record of actually receiving those calls or any corresponding voice messages. This seemed like a technical problem with our phone system, possibly related to poor cellular coverage in the area where Martin might be located. Calls from remote wilderness areas sometimes register in system logs without successfully connecting, especially when callers are at the edge of cellular range. But as the pattern continued, hourly calls from Martin's number that appeared in our logs but never rang through to our station, I began to suspect something more complex than routine technical difficulties. I contacted our phone system administrator to inquire about the incomplete calls. According to technical records, the calls were originating from Martin's device and were reaching our system successfully, but they weren't being routed to our emergency line for unknown reasons. This was concerning for obvious reasons. If Martin was attempting to call for help from a location where he had limited cellular connectivity, our technical problems might be preventing us from receiving critical emergency communications. I recommended that we prioritize locating Martin's phone signal to determine his current position and assess whether he needed immediate assistance. Cell phone triangulation in wilderness areas can be challenging, but it's often more effective than ground searches when terrain is difficult and search areas are extensive. The triangulation process took several hours to coordinate, involving multiple cellular providers and specialized equipment that had to be transported to locations where it could effectively track signals in remote areas. But by Thursday morning, we had established that Martin's phone was transmitting from a location about 3 miles off the Specimen Ridge Trail, in an area of rocky terrain that would be difficult to reach on foot. A helicopter team located the phone Thursday afternoon, sitting alone on a flat rock outcropping in an area that showed no signs of recent human activity. The phone was fully charged, appeared to be in normal working condition, and was positioned as if it had been deliberately placed rather than dropped or abandoned. But there was no sign of Martin Hendricks anywhere in the surrounding area. No personal equipment, no footprints leading to or from the location where the phone was found, no indication of how the device had reached that remote location or why it had been left there. What was most puzzling was the call log stored on Martin's phone. The device showed a record of attempted calls to our emergency number every hour for the past 2 days, starting from the time the search operation had begun. But according to the phone's internal records, none of these calls had successfully connected. This contradicted our system logs, which showed the calls as having reached our phone system, even though they hadn't been routed through to our emergency line. The discrepancy suggested technical problems that were more complex than simple connectivity issues. I worked with our technical support team to understand how Martin's phone could have been making successful calls that appeared in our system logs but weren't reaching our emergency operators. The investigation revealed inconsistencies in our phone routing protocols that couldn't be easily explained through standard technical troubleshooting. According to the cellular provider's records, Martin's phone had been transmitting calls with normal signal strength and proper routing information. Our emergency system showed these calls as received and logged. But somehow, the calls had never reached the emergency line where they could have been answered by our operators. This represented a significant failure in our emergency communication system, potentially affecting our ability to respond to people who needed immediate assistance. But the technical investigation couldn't identify specific equipment malfunctions or software problems that would account for the routing failures. More concerning was the timeline of the attempted calls. Martin's phone showed efforts to contact our emergency line beginning Tuesday afternoon, within hours of when the search operation had started. If those calls had reached us successfully, we might have been able to locate him much sooner and potentially prevent whatever had happened to him. The search for Martin Hendricks continued for another week, expanding to cover increasingly remote areas around the location where his phone had been found. But we never discovered any additional evidence of his presence in the area or any indication of what had happened to him after he'd left the Specimen Ridge Trail. Martin remains missing, and his case is still active, but has moved to a lower priority status as time has passed without new leads or evidence. His phone was returned to his family, along with the other personal effects from his car. But the mystery of how it reached that remote location and why his emergency calls never connected has never been resolved. The technical investigation into our phone system problems concluded that the routing failures were caused by an unusual combination of factors that were unlikely to recur. But the specific technical explanation was complex enough that I never fully understood how the problems had occurred or what prevented similar issues in the future. What bothers me most about the case is the thought that Martin might have been trying to reach us for help during the first crucial hours after he became lost or injured. The call logs showed persistent attempts to contact our emergency line, suggesting someone who understood the importance of getting help quickly but couldn't establish successful communication. I've started paying much closer attention to our call logs and technical systems, looking for any similar patterns or discrepancies that might indicate communications problem. I've also implemented additional verification procedures to ensure that calls showing up in our system logs are actually reaching our emergency operators. Over the past year, I haven't encountered any other cases where calls appeared in our logs without reaching our emergency line. But I've become more aware of how dependent our emergency response capabilities are on technical systems that most of us don't fully understand and that can fail in ways that aren't immediately obvious. I've also started thinking differently about missing person cases and the assumption that people who get into trouble in the wilderness will be able to call for help if they have working phones. Martin's case suggests that even when people make appropriate efforts to contact emergency services, technical problems can prevent those communications from reaching the people who can respond. Martin Hendricks' phone, sitting alone on that rock outcropping, represents more than just a missing person case that couldn't be solved. It represents a failure of systems that people depend on when they're in life-threatening situations, and the possibility that other emergency calls might not be reaching us when they should. 9 years of communications work has taught me that emergency response depends on reliable connections between people who need help and people who can provide it. But Martin's case suggests that those connections can be interrupted in ways that leave no obvious evidence of system failure until it's too late to help the people who needed assistance. I still monitor our emergency line with the same attention to detail that the job has always required, but I've never forgotten the hourly call pattern from Martin's phone or the thought that he might have been trying to reach us for 2 days while we had no idea he was attempting to communicate. The technical explanation for why his calls didn't reach us might satisfy our administrative requirements, but it doesn't answer the more fundamental question of how someone can make successful emergency calls that show up in our system logs but never ring through to the people who are supposed to answer them. 1 year later, I still check our call logs more carefully than I used to, still look for patterns that might indicate communications problems we're not detecting. And I still wonder whether Martin Hendricks spent his final days trying to call for help from people who had the technical capability to receive his calls but never heard the phone ring. My name is Dr. Sarah Collins, and I've been working as a wildlife veterinarian for the National Park Service in the Rocky Mountain region for 11 years. Most of my work involves routine animal health monitoring, wildlife population studies, and the occasional rescue of injured animals that can be treated and released back into their natural habitat. I've processed hundreds of animal remains over the years, both for research purposes and to understand mortality patterns in wilderness ecosystems. But there's one discovery I made 15 months ago that still challenges everything I understand about how remains decompose in natural environments. It was early September 2023 when I was conducting a routine survey of elk migration patterns in the remote Pinedale Creek area. This region sees very little human traffic. It's about 8 miles from the nearest established trail, accessible only by serious backcountry hiking, through challenging terrain that requires navigation skills and wilderness experience. I was documenting evidence of elk activity when I noticed what appeared to be human remains in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. My initial assessment from a distance suggested I'd encountered the skeletal remains of someone who had died in the wilderness, possibly a lost hiker whose body had decomposed naturally over time. But as I approached the site to begin proper documentation, I realized that these remains were unlike anything I'd encountered in 11 years of wildlife work. The bones were arranged in perfect anatomical position, as if someone had carefully assembled a complete human skeleton for educational or museum display purposes. Every bone was present and positioned exactly where it would be in a living person. Skull, vertebrae, ribs, arms, legs, hands, and feet, all in correct anatomical alignment. The spacing between bones was precise, maintaining the natural relationships between different skeletal elements in ways that wouldn't occur through random decomposition processes. What was most striking was the condition of the bones themselves. They were completely clean, showing no evidence of soft tissue decomposition, scavenger activity, or the kind of natural weathering you'd expect from remains that had been exposed to outdoor conditions for extended periods. In natural decomposition, bones are typically scattered by scavengers, weathered by environmental exposure, and marked by the feeding activity of various animals that process remains as part of normal ecosystem functions. These bones showed none of those characteristics. I've processed enough animal remains to recognize the patterns that indicate different types of decomposition processes. Weather exposure creates specific types of surface deterioration. Scavenger activity leaves distinctive marks and typically results in bones being scattered over considerable distances. Insect activity contributes to the cleaning process but leaves microscopic evidence of their involvement. These bones appeared to have been cleaned through some other process that I couldn't identify based on my professional experience. The surfaces were smooth and uniform, without the characteristic marks that would indicate natural scavenging or environmental weathering. I began documenting the scene according to standard protocols for human remains discovered in wilderness areas. This involves extensive photography, precise measurements, and collection of any associated evidence that might help identify the individual or understand the circumstances of their death. But there was remarkably little additional evidence to document. No clothing fragments, personal effects, or equipment that would typically be found with human remains in wilderness settings. No indication of how long the remains had been in that location or how the person had died. The clearing, where the bones were positioned, showed no signs of disturbance or activity that would explain how the remains had reached that location. No evidence of a campsite, no indication that someone had been living or staying in the area. No personal items that would suggest this had been someone's final resting place by choice or accident. I contacted park headquarters to report the discovery and request assistance from law enforcement and forensic specialists who could conduct a more thorough investigation. Human remains found on park land require careful processing to determine identity, cause of death, and whether any criminal activity might have been involved. The investigation team arrived the following day, including detectives from the county sheriff's department and a forensic anthropologist with experience in wilderness death investigations. I provided them with my documentation and accompanied them back to the site for a comprehensive examination. The forensic anthropologist was as puzzled by the remains as I had been. According to her assessment, the bones appeared to be from an adult male, probably between 30 and 50 years old, but she couldn't determine how long they had been in that location or what process had resulted in their unusually clean and arranged condition. I've never seen natural decomposition produce results like this, she told me privately. The positioning is too precise, and the bone condition doesn't match any environmental factors I can identify. The investigation expanded to include searches of the surrounding area for any additional evidence that might explain the presence of the remains or provide clues about the person's identity. But after several days of thorough searching, no additional evidence was discovered. The remains were transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for more detailed analysis, including attempts to determine identity through dental records and other forensic techniques. But without personal effects or other identifying information, the investigation faced significant challenges in establishing who the person had been or how they had ended up in such a remote location. Over the following months, I followed up on the investigation through official channels, curious about what additional analysis might reveal about the unusual condition and arrangement of the remains. But the results were inconclusive in ways that raised more questions than they answered. The forensic analysis confirmed that the bones were human and appeared to be from a single individual, but laboratory examination couldn't determine how they had been cleaned or what process had resulted in their precise anatomical arrangement. The bone surfaces showed no evidence of artificial preparation techniques, yet they also showed no evidence of natural decomposition processes. Most puzzling was the apparent age of the remains. While the bones appeared to have been cleaned and arranged recently, laboratory dating suggested they were much older than their condition would indicate. The discrepancy between the apparent freshness of the preparation and the actual age of the bones couldn't be explained through conventional forensic analysis. The case was eventually classified as an unidentified death with undetermined circumstances. Without additional evidence about the person's identity or the processes that had resulted in the unusual condition of the remains, the investigation reached the limits of what could be determined through standard forensic procedures. But my professional interest in the case continued beyond the official investigation. As a wildlife veterinarian, I was familiar with every natural process that affects remains in wilderness environments, and none of them could account for what I had observed. I began researching historical records of the Pinedale Creek area, looking for any documented incidents or reports that might relate to the discovery. The region had been used for various purposes over the decades: logging, mining, recreation, but I found no records of missing persons or unusual incidents that would explain the presence of carefully arranged human remains. I also consulted with colleagues in related fields, including forensic experts, anthropologists, and other wildlife professionals who might have encountered similar cases. But none had any experience with remains that had been found in such precise anatomical arrangement without obvious explanation for how that arrangement had been achieved. The most disturbing aspect of the case, from my professional perspective, was the implication that someone with significant knowledge of human anatomy had spent considerable time and effort preparing and arranging those remains. The precision of the positioning required understanding of skeletal structure that would be found among medical professionals, researchers, or people with specialized training in anatomy. But there was no evidence of how such preparation could have been conducted in that remote wilderness location, or why someone would have undertaken such an elaborate process without leaving any trace of their activity. I've continued my routine wildlife work in the same general area, partly because it's within my assigned territory, and partly because I remain curious about whether any additional evidence might emerge that would help explain what I discovered that September morning. The Pinedale Creek region shows normal patterns of wildlife activity and natural processes. I've documented typical animal mortality and decomposition, observed standard predator-prey relationships, and found no other unusual phenomena that would suggest ongoing abnormal activities in the area. But I've never forgotten the geometric precision of those bones, arranged with the kind of careful attention to detail that would be appropriate for educational display, but completely inexplicable in a remote wilderness setting. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to create that arrangement, using knowledge and techniques that left no trace of how the work had been accomplished. 11 years of wildlife veterinary work has taught me to understand death as a natural process that follows predictable patterns in wilderness environments. But the remains I discovered in Pinedale Creek represent something outside those patterns, something that required human intervention and expertise, but left no evidence of how that intervention had occurred. I still conduct surveys in the same area as part of my regular duties, and I still document animal remains according to standard protocol. But I've never found another site like the one where those bones were arranged, and I've never stopped wondering who had the knowledge, time, and motivation to create such a precise anatomical display in one of the most remote locations in our park system. 15 months later, the case remains unsolved, and the remains unidentified. But the image of those perfectly arranged bones continues to challenge my understanding of what's possible in wilderness environments and what kinds of activities might be occurring in places where no one is supposed to be watching. My name is Christine Foster, and I've been head ranger at Grand Canyon National Park for 18 years. I know every established trail in our system, every safety protocol, and every way that visitors can get themselves into trouble in this unforgiving landscape. I've managed rescues from the most challenging terrain, coordinated searches in weather that would challenge professional mountaineers, and helped people who made every mistake you can make in the wilderness. But there's one incident from 6 months ago that still makes me question whether I understand the geography of this place as well as I thought I did. It was mid-April 2024 when I encountered the Patterson Hiking Group returning from a 3-day backcountry trip along the South Kaibab Trail system. They were experienced hikers from Colorado, 4 adults who had been visiting Grand Canyon annually for over a decade and knew our trail network better than many casual visitors. They'd completed their planned route without incident and were checking out at the backcountry office when one of them mentioned an observation that initially seemed like a simple misunderstanding about trail markers. "We noticed some new trail markers on the second day," said Jennifer Patterson, who appeared to be the group's navigator. "Reflective tags that we hadn't seen on previous trips. They were helpful for navigation, especially in the early morning light." I was immediately curious about this observation because we hadn't installed new trail markers on the South Kaibab system in over 2 years. Any changes to established trail marking would have been coordinated through my office, and I maintained detailed records of all infrastructure modifications in the backcountry areas. "Can you describe the location where you saw these markers?" I asked. Jennifer consulted her notes and provided specific mile markers and geological reference points that corresponded to areas I knew well. According to her account, the group had encountered reflective trail markers at regular intervals along a section of trail between Skeleton Point and the Tonto platform. "They were positioned perfectly for visibility," added another group member. "Someone had done really thoughtful work, placing them where they'd be most useful for navigation." This was puzzling because the section of trail they were describing was well established and didn't require additional marking. "It's one of our most clearly defined routes, with excellent sightlines and prominent geological features that serve as natural navigation aids." I made a note to check the area they'd mentioned during my next patrol, thinking there might have been unauthorized marker installation by well-meaning hikers, or possibly maintenance work that hadn't been properly documented through our administrative systems. But when Jennifer offered to show me their GPS tracking data from the trip, I discovered something much more concerning than unofficial trail markers. The GPS device showed their hiking route as a continuous track that corresponded to their planned timeline and mileage estimates. But according to the coordinates recorded by their device, significant portions of their route passed through areas that were solid rock face, vertical cliff sections where hiking would be physically impossible. "There must be some kind of calibration error with your GPS," I suggested, thinking the device had recorded inaccurate position data due to the challenging terrain and satellite reception issues that commonly affect electronic navigation in the canyon. But Jennifer was confident about her GPS system, which she'd been using for wilderness navigation for several years without encountering significant accuracy problems. She showed me how the device had recorded waypoints and elevation data that matched her manual navigation notes throughout the trip. "The timeline is perfect," she said, comparing her GPS data to handwritten logs of rest stops, meal breaks, and notable landmarks. "We maintained our planned pace and hit every checkpoint exactly when we expected to." I reviewed their GPS track more carefully, using my detailed knowledge of the South Kaibab trail system to compare their recorded route with actual trail locations. The discrepancies were impossible to dismiss as technical errors. According to their GPS data, the Patterson Group had spent over 3 hours hiking through an area known as Redwall Limestone Cliff Face, a vertical rock formation that extends for several hundred feet without any established trails or safe passage routes. During that same time period, Jennifer's notes indicated they had been following well-marked trail with normal hiking conditions and regular rest stops. "Are you certain you stayed on the established trail system throughout your trip?" I asked. The group was adamant that they had followed standard route markers and had never deviated from established trails. They described familiar landmarks, typical trail conditions, and the kind of routine hiking experience that experienced backcountry visitors would expect from the South Kaibab system. But their GPS track showed them walking through terrain where walking was impossible, maintaining normal hiking pace through areas that would require technical climbing equipment and specialized mountaineering skills to traverse. I spent several hours that afternoon reviewing topographical maps and comparing the Patterson Group's GPS data with known trail locations. The discrepancies weren't minor calibration errors or temporary signal interference. They represented fundamental contradictions between recorded positions and actual geography. The GPS track showed the group maintaining consistent hiking pace and direction through cliff faces, river crossings, and terrain features that would have required significantly different travel times and specialized equipment to navigate safely. Most concerning was the precision of their timeline. If the GPS data was accurate, the Patterson Group had somehow covered impossible terrain in exactly the time it would take to hike the established trail system. Their pace, rest intervals, and overall timing matched perfectly with normal backcountry hiking expectations. I decided to hike the route myself the following day, following the exact trail system that the Patterson Group claimed to have used, and comparing my observations with their GPS track and navigation notes. The established South Kaibab trail system was exactly as I expected, clearly marked, well-maintained, passing through familiar terrain that I'd hiked hundreds of times over 18 years. No new trail markers, no infrastructure changes, no obvious factors that would explain the GPS discrepancies recorded by the Patterson Group. But when I reached the areas where their GPS showed them hiking through cliff faces, I found myself paying closer attention to the terrain than I usually would during routine patrols. Not because I expected to discover hidden trails or alternative routes, but because I was trying to understand how their electronic navigation could have recorded such precise but impossible tracking data. The cliff sections were exactly as they appeared on topographical maps, vertical rock faces, with no practical hiking routes, requiring technical climbing skills and equipment that the Patterson Group had not carried. Yet their GPS showed them maintaining normal hiking pace through these areas, taking scheduled rest breaks, and continuing their journey without apparent difficulty. I consulted with our technical support specialists about GPS accuracy issues and the types of errors that might explain the Patterson Group's tracking data. But the level of systematic error required to produce their GPS track would have affected all aspects of their navigation, not just specific coordinates in challenging terrain. Over the following weeks, I began paying more attention to GPS data provided by other backcountry visitors, looking for similar discrepancies or patterns that might indicate ongoing technical problems with electronic navigation in our park system. But I encountered no other cases where GPS tracking showed hikers passing through impossible terrain while maintaining normal hiking timelines. The Patterson Group's GPS data remained unique in my experience of reviewing hundreds of backcountry navigation records. What continues to bother me most about the incident is the consistency between their GPS track, their written navigation notes, and their subjective experience of the hiking trip. Every aspect of their documentation suggested a normal 3-day backcountry experience following established trails through familiar terrain. Yet their electronic navigation showed them accomplishing something that was physically impossible, hiking through solid rock at normal pace, while following what they perceived as standard trail markers and routine route conditions. I've hiked the South Kaibab system dozens of times since reviewing the Patterson Group's GPS data, always paying particular attention to the areas where their tracking showed impossible terrain crossing. The geography remains exactly as it appears on maps, and as I've known it for 18 years of ranger work. But I've started carrying multiple GPS devices during backcountry patrols, comparing readings from different units and documenting any discrepancies that might indicate technical problems with electronic navigation systems. So far, all devices have shown consistent and accurate position data that matches actual terrain features. The Patterson Group's case was documented as a technical anomaly, with electronic navigation equipment filed under equipment malfunction reports that accumulate whenever GPS systems encounter challenging conditions in wilderness environments. But the technical explanation doesn't account for the precision of their impossible GPS track, or the perfect correlation between their recorded timeline and the normal pace required to complete their planned hiking route. Someone or something enabled them to cover terrain that couldn't be hiked in exactly the time it would take to hike the trail they thought they were following. 6 months later, I continue managing backcountry operations with the same attention to safety protocols and navigation systems that the job has always required. But I've never forgotten the certainty in Jennifer Patterson's voice when she described following clearly marked trails through terrain that didn't exist, or the precision of GPS data that showed normal hiking through impossible geography. 18 years of ranger work has taught me to trust accurate maps, reliable navigation systems, and the consistent relationship between terrain features and hiking capabilities. But the Patterson Group's experience suggests that there might be aspects of this landscape that operate according to different rules, or that electronic navigation systems might sometimes record journeys that transcend the physical limitations of the geography they're supposed to map. I still patrol the same trail systems and provide the same navigation guidance to backcountry visitors, but I've never stopped wondering how 4 experienced hikers could spend 3 days walking through solid rock while believing they were following established trails that led them exactly where they intended to go. My name is Eddie Cruz, and I've been working maintenance for the Forest Service in the Adirondack region for 8 years. It's steady work that I've always enjoyed. Routine facility upkeep, seasonal preparations, the kind of solitary tasks that let you work at your own pace in some of the most peaceful country you'll find anywhere. I've serviced hundreds of remote cabins, fire towers, and research stations without ever feeling uncomfortable about working alone in isolated locations. But there's one cabin I worked on 10 months ago that changed how I think about being by myself in the wilderness. And I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I wasn't actually alone there at all. Cabin 12 is a maintenance station about 6 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail or snowmobile, depending on the season. It's one of 12 similar structures built in the 1970s to support backcountry operations, basic shelter with propane heating, minimal electrical systems, and storage for equipment and supplies that field crews might need during extended assignment. Most of these cabins see regular use during busy seasons, but Cabin 12 had been unoccupied for several months when I received the work order to perform routine maintenance and prepare it for potential summer assignments. According to the scheduling system, no one had been assigned to that location since the previous October, which meant it probably needed more attention than facilities that get regular occupancy and care. It was early March 2024 when I hiked out to Cabin 12 with my standard maintenance kit and supplies for what I expected to be a 2-day job. The trail was still covered with late winter snow, but travel conditions were manageable for someone with appropriate gear and experience hiking in winter conditions. The cabin appeared normal from the outside, properly secured. No obvious damage from weather or wildlife. The kind of solid condition you'd expect from a well-built structure that had been closed up properly before winter. But when I unlocked the door and began my initial inspection, I immediately noticed signs that someone had been using the facility more recently than the scheduling records indicated. The cabin was clean, not just organized, but actively clean in a way that suggested recent occupancy and maintenance. No dust accumulation on surfaces. No evidence of the kind of settling that occurs when buildings sit empty for extended periods. The propane system showed recent use, with levels in the storage tanks that were consistent with heating and cooking activity within the past few weeks. Most notably, I found fresh coffee grounds in the kitchen trash container. Not just any coffee grounds, but the distinctive residue from the high-quality blend that field crews typically carry for extended assignments. These weren't old grounds that had dried out over months of storage. They were fresh enough that I could still detect the characteristic aroma. This suggested that someone had been using Cabin 12 recently, despite the scheduling system showing no authorized occupancy since October. I made a note to check with headquarters about possible unscheduled use or emergency assignments that might not have been properly documented in our normal tracking systems. But as I continued my inspection and began routine maintenance tasks, I started noticing other details that made me increasingly uncomfortable about being alone in the cabin. I kept feeling like someone was watching me work, even though I'd confirmed the building was empty and there were no other people in the immediate area. This sensation was persistent and specific, not the general awareness that comes from working in wilderness areas where wildlife might be observing human activity, but the distinct feeling of being watched by another person. I found myself checking over my shoulder frequently and looking out windows more often than I normally would during routine maintenance work. The feeling was strong enough that I conducted additional searches of the cabin and surrounding area, thinking there might be someone nearby who I hadn't initially detected. But I found no signs of recent human presence outside the building, no equipment or personal items that would indicate someone was camping or working in the area. As I worked through my maintenance checklist, I discovered additional evidence of recent occupancy that couldn't be explained by the scheduling records. Personal items in the cabin that weren't part of standard Forest Service inventory, a coffee mug that wasn't from our supply system, reading material that wasn't part of official documentation, small organizational changes that suggested someone had been living in the space and arranging it according to their personal preferences. None of these items were obviously problematic, but together they indicated that Cabin 12 had been occupied by someone who either wasn't properly reporting their use of the facility or was using it without authorization. The most disturbing discovery came when I reviewed the maintenance logbook to document my work and check previous service records. The logbook showed regular maintenance entries through the previous summer, then a gap corresponding to the period when the cabin had been officially unoccupied. But the most recent entry in the logbook was dated just 2 weeks earlier, and it was written in handwriting that looked exactly like mine. The entry documented routine maintenance tasks that I would normally perform, checking propane systems, testing electrical connections, cleaning and organizing storage areas. The problem was that I had never been to Cabin 12 before that March day. I was certain about this because I maintained careful records of my work assignments and had never received a work order for that particular facility. Yet the logbook clearly showed maintenance work documented in handwriting that appeared to be mine, signed with what looked like my signature. I compared the recent logbook entry with my own handwriting in previous entries at other facilities, and the similarities were unmistakable. Same pen pressure, same letter formation, same characteristic way I abbreviated technical terms and recorded completion times. But I had no memory of visiting Cabin 12 or performing the maintenance work described in that recent entry. More concerning, the scheduling system showed no work orders for me at that location during the time frame indicated by the logbook entry. This discrepancy was impossible to explain through normal administrative errors or memory lapses. I keep detailed personal records of my work assignments, and there was no way I could have forgotten making a 6-mile hike to perform maintenance work at a remote cabin. I spent that first night in cabin 12, feeling increasingly uncomfortable about the unexplained evidence of recent occupancy and the logbook entry that appeared to be in my handwriting, but documented work I had never performed. The persistent feeling of being watched continued throughout the evening, making it difficult to focus on routine tasks or rest properly. The second day of maintenance work was when I decided I needed to complete the assignment quickly and return to headquarters to report the unusual conditions I'd encountered. But as I prepared to finish up and leave the cabin, I discovered one more troubling detail. Fresh coffee grounds had appeared in the kitchen trash since the previous day, even though I hadn't made coffee and hadn't seen any indication of other people using the facility. The grounds were from the same high-quality blend I'd found during my initial inspection, suggesting that someone had been using the kitchen area while I was working elsewhere in the cabin. This was the point when I realized that my feeling of being watched might have been accurate, and that someone might have been sharing the cabin with me without my knowledge. But despite careful searching, I found no hiding places within the building where someone could have concealed themselves during my inspections. I packed up my equipment and left cabin 12 that afternoon, hiking back to the road access point more quickly than I normally would after completing a maintenance assignment. The combination of unexplained occupancy evidence, the impossible logbook entry, and the persistent feeling of being observed had made the cabin feel fundamentally unsafe in ways I couldn't articulate. When I returned to headquarters, I filed a report documenting the discrepancies I'd encountered and recommending that cabin 12 be investigated for unauthorized use. But when supervisors reviewed the scheduling system and maintenance records, they found no obvious administrative errors that would explain the problems I'd reported. The logbook entry that appeared to be in my handwriting was verified as authentic by handwriting comparison. Yet I maintained that I had never performed the work it documented. This created an administrative problem that couldn't be resolved through normal verification procedures. Rather than continue trying to explain the unexplained, I requested a transfer to different maintenance responsibilities that wouldn't require extended solo assignments at remote facilities. I'd been comfortable working alone for 8 years, but the experience at cabin 12 had fundamentally changed my willingness to spend time by myself in isolated locations. My transfer request was approved without significant questions, and I was reassigned to maintenance duties that involved teamwork and facilities closer to populated areas. I've been working these new assignments for 10 months now, and I haven't experienced any of the unease or unexplained phenomena that I encountered at cabin 12. But I've never stopped thinking about that logbook entry in my own handwriting, documenting work I never performed at a facility I'd never visited. The administrative explanation is that I must have forgotten making the trip, despite having no memory of it and no official record of the assignment. The alternative explanation is that someone else had been using cabin 12 and had somehow replicated my handwriting well enough to fool handwriting analysis. But that would require access to samples of my writing and skills that would be difficult to develop without professional training. 8 years of Forest Service maintenance work has taught me to document what I observe and report problems through appropriate channels. But the cabin 12 incident involved observations that couldn't be adequately documented and problems that couldn't be resolved through normal administrative procedures. I still work for the Forest Service, but I've never requested another assignment that would require spending nights alone at remote facilities. The isolation that I used to find peaceful now feels potentially dangerous in ways that I can't explain to people who weren't there. 10 months later, I still wonder who was watching me work at cabin 12, and whether the person making fresh coffee while I slept was the same person who knew how to write maintenance reports in handwriting that looked exactly like mine. But I've never been willing to return to that cabin to find out.